Iceberg charts. They're a thing, right? Okay, I know I'm like really late to this whole thing, but I've been keeping this whole idea on a back burner for quite a long while at this point. So, about a year and a half, maybe even 2 years ago, around the time the Super Mario 64 Iceberg was first making the rounds, members of the Code and 4chan came together, which basically never happens these days, to make an iceberg chart featuring a massive laundry list of theories surrounding the mediums of cartoons and comic books. They made two actually, but for most of these, I'm just going to be sticking with this one here. In case you've been living under a rock for the past 2 years, in which case I envy you, just think of the phrase tip of the iceberg for this whole concept. Better known stuff at the top, lesser known and more creepy and outlandish stuff at the bottom. Oh, and since this is 4chan we're talking about, don't expect much of these, especially further down, to be anything actually serious. This is all just going to be a bunch of dumb ideas around things people like to read and watch. This definitely isn't going to be quick though, so either put this on for background noise while you do other things, or just sit back and grab a glass of orange juice and strap in, as we dive down into the depths of this iceberg-infested water. Walt Disney was anti-Semitic. Alright, off to a good start. So, like many people in his day, Walt Disney, a man who arguably kickstarted the modern animation industry, likely held rather unsavoury beliefs towards Jews. The best known example of these ideas in his work would be the 1933 film Three Little Pigs.
Don't know about you, but if my dad was executed and eaten, I wouldn't be hanging a framed picture of his remains.
Featuring a segment where the wolf dressed up as a Jewish merchant, complete with a stereotypical Yiddish accent.
I'm the full brush man. I'm giving a free sample.
The dialogue was edited to sound less Jewish, I guess. In a 1948 re-release of the film,
I'm the full brush man. I'm working my way through college.
there's also discussion about how he associated with rather unsavoury characters, including Nazi propaganda film director Leni Riefenstahl, who he welcomed to his studio just a week after the events of Kristallnacht. Still, many of his Jewish co-workers denied he was openly anti-Semitic towards them, and much of these behaviours had largely subsided following World War II. There's also a fair deal of evidence to suggest that Disney was racist, but that's a whole different story. Walt Disney's frozen head. Speaking of Disney, it was widely believed that after he died, his body, or just his head depending on who you ask, was cryogenically frozen and is now located somewhere in Disneyland, waiting to be revived to do whatever you can do if you're just a head in a jar. However, it's now commonly known that he wasn't frozen after his death, rather he was burnt after death through cremation. The Pixar Universe Theory. This suggests that every film created by Pixar is set in the same universe, with this theory having been developed by observers for over 15 years, who've adapted it over time to fit in with every new release created by Pixar. But how does that work exactly? Like, how exactly do Finding Nemo and Cars, for example, two films with completely different settings, connect with one another? Well, according to the theory, the dumping of toxic waste by humans results in animals such as fish gaining human-like sentience, like another theory we'll touch on later. These animals end up resenting humans and they proceed to fight a massive war, which the humans win thanks to the self-aware machines they created, who send the humans off into space while they run the Earth their own way, simultaneously leading into the events of WALL-E. The whole thing's really complicated, so if you want to hear more about the theory, then there's plenty of info online about it. Elsagate. A couple years ago, there were these weird YouTube videos aimed towards young children that all seem to feature a specific set of characters, including Elsa from Frozen and Spider-Man from Spider-Man, and some really strange and uncomfortable themes that wouldn't really be what you call child-friendly, including kidnapping, gore, death, syringes up people's asses, more syringes up people's asses, and some other junk. Many of these videos feel extremely similar to one another, and many speculated that these were all created by a ring of pedos to desensitize children to such imagery, which seemed possible as there are many cases of abuse happening among those who owned toy channels at the time. Eventually, after 2 years of YouTubers recognising this problem, YouTube themselves finally stepped in around early 2018 to crack down on this content. So don't worry, your kids are safe, just keep them off the internet if you're worried. The protagonist of a show is in a coma, the cast represents drugs, mental illnesses, deadly sins or whatever, or the show takes place in hell or purgatory. If you've heard any theory about any cartoon show ever, then they most likely fall into one of these categories. Ash and Finn are in comas, all the characters in the Magic Roundabout are junkies, SpongeBob and co represent the 7 deadly sins, the cul-de-sac in Ed, Edd and Eddy is purgatory, Angelica made them all up, the list goes on. Whilst you can't exactly prove that these aren't true, the subjects have been done to death and they basically just feel like baby's first conspiracy theory. Lost episodes. If you've ever heard an online legend about any cartoon and it didn't fit into the previous categories, then it probably fits into this one. Stop me if you heard this one before. I was an intern at and I found this weird tape in the garbage or some backroom. I took it home and used that VHS player that I still have in current year for some reason to watch it, I inserted a tape and it was an episode of but wasn't on the title screen like they usually would be. Then the episode's name comes up. Suicide, dead, or the death of. It showed them staring at me with hyper-realistic, copyrighted, bloodshot eyes, and they told me I was going to die in 7 days before they shot themselves, and the episode cut to a picture of a deer carcass or something. Yeah, that's kind of vague, but you get the idea. Squidward suicide, suicide mouse, dead bot, you know him, you love him, maybe. They're just dumb horror stories that have been knocking around for years, like many of the previous theories have been. The Simpsons predicted everything. Apparently the Simpsons can predict the future. This all kind of stemmed from a few early examples, like how in the episode The City of New York vs Homer Simpson, there was an advertisement for a bus service to New York for $9, with the World Trade Center in the background resulting in an 11 being made out. Ergo, the Simpsons predicted 9/11 4 years before it happened. But let's be real, it's probably all just bollocks. 9/11 was just a name we retroactively gave to the disaster and nothing tragic was implied in this prediction. It's about as much of a reference to 9/11 as it is a reference to the emergency service number. Still, these prediction claims kicked into overdrive following Trump's win in 2016, using a line in the 2000 episode Bart's of the Future, referring to how the country went broke after the rule of President Trump, as an example of The Simpsons predicting something, disregarding the fact that Trump was actually running as a third-party candidate in that year's election and had been eyeing the presidency since the 80s. People also claimed it predicted COVID using an out-of-context image, and the death of George Floyd using an obviously fake and honestly rather crude drawing. JJ McCullough did a video on this a while back, and he helps explain how many of these so-called predictions actually have very mundane meanings behind them. Tom and Jerry train suicide. In the 1956 short film Blue Cat Blues, Tom is seen sitting on a train track looking depressed, after finding out that a cat he loved was now married to another man cat. Jerry is shown having mixed feelings about his past with Tom, but after seeing someone he loves run off with someone else, Jerry decides to join Tom and they both wallow in each other's sadness, waiting for a passing train to bring about the sweet release of death. Whilst the short was extremely dark on its own, a rumour spread that this was the last theatrical short film to feature the cat and mouse, having the official canon end with the two offing themselves. However, whilst this idea sounds interesting in a morbid kind of way, this isn't actually true. The last MGM produced Tom and Jerry cartoon didn't come out until 2 years later, with Top Watchers in 1958, and a second run with Chuck Jones at the helm took place during the 1960s. However, to be fair, many of these had a largely different animation style compared to Blue Cat Blues and the shorts before it, and it could be assumed that these were shown on television rather than in cinemas. I don't know though, I'm assuming that was the thought process behind it all. Coraline is still in the other world. Coraline is definitely one of those films. The kind that, whilst marketing itself towards children, isn't exactly willing to shy away from the use of unsettling and sometimes outright disturbing imagery. So it makes it all the more conclusive when the film ends on a light note, with Coraline being reunited with her family after escaping the other world. Or at least that's just how it seems. The whole story is built around the concept of a fake world that appears just like the real one, but is meant to function as an ideal place for children to be lured in by its demonic creator, the Beldam. The key distinguisher between these two worlds in reality is that all creatures have buttons for eyes, though this might not always be the case, as we can see briefly by this one scene, in which the Beldam briefly takes a form that better resembles Coraline's trapped mother, most notably not including the button eyes, though she quickly reverts back when Coraline lets her guard down. It suggests that she may be better at disguising her appearance than she usually lets on, so who's to say that she's not able to create a more realistic version of the entire building, one that her victim won't suspect is a facade until it's too late. Whilst there isn't really much discussion I could find by the original author Neil Gaiman or director Henry Selick, which confirmed or denied the theory's legitimacy, and it's commonly accepted that Coraline did make it out in order to not leave its younger audience wrought with existential dread. Neither the film, nor the original book it was based on, officially state that she definitely made out the other world. Plus, seeing how Neil Gaiman's general writing style suggests that he would likely be more open to this interpretation, it seems that this theory, unlike quite a few others here, might actually have some legs to it. The Lion King ripped off Kimber the White Lion. It's commonly floated around that the 1994 Disney animated classic The Lion King is suspiciously similar to the 1965 early anime series Kimber the White Lion, seeing how both works feature a young lion in a leadership role in the savannas of Africa, whilst also noting how a quick look at Disney's company history suggests that they don't have an original bone in their body. It would make sense on the surface for this theory to be true. However, beyond this point, there are practically no similarities between the two works. Much of the shot-by-shot comparisons used by those justifying the rumour actually come from remakes of the series that came out after The Lion King, and many of the shots that don't are taken completely out of context, just like the Simpsons predictions. And like the Simpsons predictions, there's a much better video out there explaining why this theory is wrong. Adam from Your Movie Sucks posted a 2.5 hour long video basically noting that, while some people on the team may have been inspired by Kimber at one point, The two works share basically no similarities with each other besides featuring young lions in leadership roles with similar sounding names, and even this point is only true for the Western version of the show. In Japan, Kimber was originally known as Jungle Emperor Leo, but this was changed in the American dub as broadcasters were looking for a more marketable name, hence why he's called Kimber and not Simba, a word that's already Swahili for lion. Just check the video out for more info, because the whole thing's actually quite in depth. The original Suicide Squad cuts. Whilst Marvel Cinematic Universe has been extremely successful throughout its run, DC's most recent films have been fairly hit or miss, which is a shame as many of them would apparently be much better if it wasn't for studio executives or sudden changes in crew making shit all confusing. Most people with any knowledge of the recent DC movies would be aware of the infamous Snyder cuts of Justice League, which, after enough complaints by fans, has since seen an official release. But there was also another cut of the somewhat equally panned Suicide Squad, which has also seen a fair deal of conversation itself. The original cut, nicknamed the Aya cut, would have featured much more interesting stuff involving Jared Leto's Joker, including a scene showcasing his assault on Arkham Asylum, which would have helped some of the scenes in the theatrical release make more sense. The cut itself does exist, though it's unknown when or if it will ever be released, especially since a soft reboot by James Gunn came out in 2021, though the current rights holders to the film, HBO Max, have also helped to release a Snyder cut, so fingers crossed. A113. A113 is a small Easter egg that has been featured in numerous shows and films, including practically every film ever made by Pixar. You can see it on license plates, everyday objects, and a number was even a name given to the key plot points in the film WALL-E. Some are easier to spot than others, but if you look hard enough you can find them. Some dispute the meaning behind this Easter egg, but in reality it's actually just a reference to the classroom used by animation students at CalArts, such as John Lasseter and Brad Bird, the latter of whom said he aimed to put it in every production he was a part of, which is why it also makes many appearances in many episodes of The Simpsons that he worked on. Since Lasseter and Bird were key players in Pixar's history, it would make sense for most of the references to be there. The original Food Fight was stolen completely. You know Food Fight, right? That $65 million feature-length commercial with animation straight out the deepest depths of mocap hell? Well, you might also be aware that it wasn't supposed to be the movie that it turned out to be, at least technically speaking. The film was released in 2012, but its production started all the way back in 1999, with a planned theatrical release in late 2003. The original version appeared to have significantly better animation, especially when you consider it being produced in the early days of CGI feature films, with squash and stretch effects being used to give the film some level of personality, and helped it to connect better with the old-style cartoons that preceded this. However, this all changed in late 2002, when the film's director Larry Kasanoff claimed that all the files in the film were stolen in a so-called act of industrial espionage, though this claim has since been disputed. Despite this, Kasanoff would continue to work on the film for just under a decade, when it was given an extremely limited release in some parts of the world like Russia and the UK, and went straight to DVD in the US a few months later, after failing to meet deadlines and cutting corners such as moving towards motion capture. Some could suggest that if its original version was completed, then the film would have turned out much better, but honestly if it wasn't for the film's constant use of product placements, which had been a point of contention since production began, it probably would have faded into obscurity like many early 2000s CGI films like Buzino and the Snurks, which you probably wouldn't know anything about if it wasn't for people like Saberspark bringing them up. Subliminal sexual messages in Disney films. If you've been on the internet for more than 2 minutes, then you've probably seen videos or read articles about the apparent existence of subliminal messages in innocent-looking Disney films. These include, but aren't limited to, the dust that apparently spells out sex in The Lion King, the nude woman in The Rescuers, Jessica Rabbit going commando in Roger Rabbit, and the Bishop's boner in The Little Mermaid.
Boner! 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 Good start.
Many of these messages were removed from later home releases of these films once they were pointed out by strangely attentive viewers, and whilst Disney, especially during this era, was known to push risque jokes for parents watching with their kids,
I thought the Earth wasn't supposed to move until the honeymoon.
the way these messages were shown resulted in some people growing wary of the reasons why they were there, like they were meant to manipulate their young viewers by instilling unsavoury images into their minds. The explanation though is much more innocent, for the most part at least. The dust in The Lion King was actually meant to say SFX in a nod to the special effects team, and in The Little Mermaid it was actually the bishop's knee that was sticking out, as opposed to his member. The other 2 points though were actually meant to be there, but only really as in-jokes by the animators, as The Rescuers and Roger Rabbit were released around a time when home video was in its infancy, and it wasn't like people were going to notice these messages if they showed up for only a couple frames, since they weren't able to pause or rewind the film for a closer look. Since this point in time, there have been fewer examples of these messages showing up in films releasing nowadays, in an age of streaming services, so this might seem like a fairly logical explanation, at least, unless that's the explanation that they want us to think. The real bones on Pirates of the Caribbean. Numerous curious fanatics of Disney's many parks have noticed a rather gruesome oddity hidden within one of the most notable rides of the original Disneyland park. This being a skull and crossbones on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, which appears noticeably more discoloured than the other skeletons on the attraction. There's a commonly floated rumour that this is because back when the ride opened, all of the skeletons and bones featured were actually real, with the skull and crossbones being the only ones that weren't replaced by clay models later on. There have also been additional rumours spread around the internet that none of the bones were ever replaced, or that the skull and crossbones weren't changed because it was Walt Disney's skull, of course. From all the information we know, it turns out that the initial rumour of all the original skeletons featured in Pirates of the Caribbean being real was indeed true, before they were replaced years later by replicas, which might include the elusive skull and crossbones, as there's little evidence to suggest that they're the same ones that were present when the ride opened. Using real bones is actually common practice back when the ride opened in the 1960s, with them being used for both educational and filming purposes, as the fake skeletons Imagineers were capable of creating at the time were not up to scuff with the realism the team were attempting to give off. If you want to hear more on the subject, then I suggest looking up Quinton Reviews' video about it, which is where much of my information for this topic came from. The abandoned Disney Island. Whilst we're still on the subject of Disney's parks, this point might be referring to Discovery Island, an old fixture of Disney World which basically functions as a massive zoo off the coast, opening in 1974 before basically being replaced by the much more accessible Animal Kingdom, and closing in 1999. Since then, the establishment was shrouded in mystery. Its separation from land made it practically impossible to access regularly, and many of those that could, such as Disney World employees, would immediately face sanctions such as termination, barring from all Disney attractions, or even arrest for trespassing, like the case of a local Florida man, who was arrested in 2020 after managing to camp out in the park unnoticed. The hoops that people had to go through in order to get there, coupled with the risks of actually undertaking this journey, resulted in there being no video footage of the park being publicly available after its closure until 2017, with only 2 other expeditions in the 2000s being everything that could be worked off of until then. These issues surrounding the island resulted in it being shrouded in mystery. Perhaps there was a reason why Disney was so adamant in keeping this park unknown to the outside world, and whilst nothing particularly suspicious was found once video footage emerged, it still seems strange that Disney was sitting on this island property for so long and had no idea what to do with it. Apparently there were plans such as building small villas on the island for honeymoons, turning the area into a massive treasure hunting field, and apparently even creating a park based on the video game Myst, but none of these managed to get anywhere. Discovery Island likely served as a basis for the classic creepypasta Abandoned by Disney, which might also be what this point is referring to. However, the areas mentioned in the pasta, Mowgli's Palace and Treasure Island in the Bahamas, never existed as Disney properties, or were far removed from much of the Disney brand, as was the case of Treasure Island or Treasure Key, as it was actually known, which was only really part of a Disney-themed cruise line that stopped there. Mickey Mouse sex tape. Now then, let's dive back into some real crazy stuff again. This point refers to an urban legend first mentioned in the 1994 book, Walt Disney, Hollywood's Dark Prince, and it would be mentioned again by its author Mark Elliott a year later in a documentary series Secret Lives. The short was allegedly created by a pair of animators for Walt Disney's 35th birthday, featuring Mickey and Minnie doing it, for a lack of better words. When the short was later presented to Disney and his crew, Disney proceeded to feign laughter and praise the quality of the animation, before asking for the 2 people who created it to come up. When the 2 animators came forward, Disney fired them on the spot and promptly left the building, reflective of his reputation of being a rather puritanical figure in the industry. The short itself was never found, as Disney would have likely had any copies of it destroyed, though it's commonly speculated that the short itself never existed, especially considering that Elliott's book was criticised for being inconsistent and factually inaccurate, with animation historian Michael Barrier going as far as to call it the worst Disney biography he's ever read. A similar rumour spread around surrounding a film involving Popeye and Betty Boop having sex, created by Fleischer Studios after they moved to Florida, which apparently included voice acting, detailed backgrounds, and even a musical score, which honestly just sounds even more ridiculous. We'll probably never know if these shorts ever existed, let alone if they're still out there. But still, I guess they make for decent conversation starters. The Superman Curse. If you've looked over the lives of the many actors to play Clark Kent on screen, you'd notice an interesting correlation between them, in that many of them seem to have suffered serious life injuries or other cases of what you could describe as bad luck. The most infamous example of this curse would be the disfigurement of Christopher Reeve, the man who played Superman in his best-known film appearance in 1978, who fell off a horse and broke his neck, before relying on life support for the last 9 years of his life. Beyond this, there have been examples of the Superman curse tracing back to his first on-screen appearance in the 1940s, with Kirk Allen seeing his career falter after his tenure as Superman due to being typecast as the character. Then there's also George Reeves, whose death by gunfire was shrouded in mystery, with many debating if it was a suicide or perhaps a murder with an unknown culprit. Not even those who didn't play the character were apparently safe from the curse. Marlon Brando, who played Superman's father Jor-El, would see his private life fall apart. His son Christian would murder the boyfriend of his sister Cheyenne, who in turn would commit suicide 5 years later at the age of just 25. Dana Reeve, Christopher's wife, would also die of lung cancer in her mid-40s, despite having never smoked in her life. There are even 3 separate cases of staff members for the DVD of Superman Returns being injured in some way. All this would seem like definitive proof that some divine or demonic force was trying to get some kind of message across surrounding Superman, but as much as there are cases of Superman actors suffering from serious issues in their lives, there have also been many examples where this isn't the case. For example, Henry Cavill has played the character multiple times for almost a decade, and hasn't dealt with anything particularly serious, at least not yet. Some of these events could also be chalked up to outside factors, as was the case of Margot Kidder, who played Lois Lane in the Christopher Reeve films, and went missing for many days before being discovered in a distressed state later on. However, Kidder had long suffered from mental health issues such as bipolar disorder, and had gone missing after suffering a manic episode. The Superman curse is one of the most infamous urban legends in discussions surrounding film and comics, due to the many coincidences surrounding it. However, that's all they really are, coincidences, and there's little out there to suggest that there's any more of an explanation beyond this. Inspector Gadget is a robot duplicate. This was a bit more difficult to find info on compared to the previous points, so maybe it might have worked better if it was further down on the chart than here. Anyway, from what I managed to find, this theory doesn't have anything to do with the robot clone in the film with Matthew Broderick, but instead claims that the Inspector Gadget from the original series was actually a robot clone, with the actual Inspector being Dr. Claw, who gained his persona after he was left horribly disfigured during one of his missions, and he was assumed to be dead by his niece Penny. This resulted in her recreating her uncle to fill in the hole left by the original Gadget, who would then go on to thwart the plans of the real Inspector, who had gone insane as a result of his disfigurements. This can explain a few things in the show, most notably the fact that Penny would often solve Gadget's cases in the end, despite Claw's minions trying their hardest to take her down alongside him, as Dr. Claw may still care deeply for Penny. However, there are also a large number of flaws surrounding this theory, the most notable of which being that there are actual examples of Dr. Claw's face floating around, such as in toys, and even an appearance in an official video game, where he looks strongly dissimilar to the real Gadget. Well, to be fair, you could also chalk this up to the result of the aforementioned disfigurements, but the flaws also go deeper than that. Users on the fan forum IGN Limited put together a list of flaws with the theory, essentially concluding that this idea could easily be disproven by just watching the show. For example, the episode All That Glitters shows that Claw doesn't personally know Penny, simply referring to her as Gadget's niece. There have also been cases of Penny being in actual life-threatening situations, such as in the episodes All That Glitters and the Cuckoo Clock Caper, where she is almost thrown off of a cliff and was close to being crushed by a hammer-based contraption. The episode Crash Course in Crime is also set during the 8th anniversary of MAD, Dr. Claw's organisation of evildoing, meaning that Penny, who was 10 in the series, would have to be at most 2 years old by the time she recreated Gadget, which, even for a light-hearted 80s cartoon, is a bit hard to believe. Finally, there's the fact that there's no proof that Gadget was a robot created by Penny, as the story itself tells us that the Inspector was a cyborg who was augmented thanks to the work of Professor von Slicksvine, I think that's how I pronounce his name, and Professor Gizmo. In the end, this all seems to be yet another example of a theory that tries to add depth and a dark backstory to an innocent-looking kids show, but this attempt falls flat if it's presented to anyone with more than a surface-level knowledge of the show. Bikini Bottom is a result of nuclear testing. This point isn't actually on the main iceberg, but you couldn't discuss theories surrounding cartoons and comics without mentioning this commonly floated theory. Besides, I've already alluded to it earlier in the chart, so I guess I should probably just discuss it a bit more to make it feel like I'm getting somewhere. Anyways, this theory claims basically what it says on the tin, that SpongeBob and Co were created as a result of radiation and pollution from nuclear testing. This mainly comes from the fact that the show is set in Bikini Bottom, which is located underneath the real-life Bikini Atoll. This island was subject to experimental nuclear detonations during the late 1940s, long before people were aware of the A-bomb's consequences to nature and wildlife, with explosions taking place on land, in the air, and most notably, underwater. The impact of these explosions was so severe that attempts to repopulate the island in the 1970s were abandoned after large quantities of strontium-90 and cesium-137, both highly radioactive isotopes common in heavily polluted areas such as Chernobyl, were found in drinking wells and on the locals themselves. Naturally, this impact wouldn't necessarily stop at humans, and this theory posits that this real-life distortion of nature would serve as the basis for the world of SpongeBob SquarePants, explaining the unnatural appearances and human-like intelligence of the show's characters compared to regular seafaring creatures. However, whilst like most other theories this makes sense on the surface, this can easily be debunked by a long list of conflicting info in the show itself. For example, the episodes SB-129 and UGG show that sentient sea life has existed in the SpongeBob universe since prehistoric times. In addition, Mr. Krabs' driving license seen in the episode Sleepy Time shows his birth year as 1942, predating any nuclear testing on the island, or anywhere for that matter. meaning that he would have to have mutated during his early years, as opposed to most cases which mutate during gestation. And even then, Bikini Bottom was shown to be a functioning society, with services such as kindergartens and elementary schools already existing in Krabs' early years. And to throw another spanner in the works, how is Sandy on any level supposed to act similarly to the main cast, seeing how she grew up almost entirely in Texas, away from any nuclear testing? I know that trying to apply things like science and continuity is a pretty dumb idea when it comes to SpongeBob SquarePants, but even disregarding the tone of the show, this idea holds little merit once you do some light research. Like many similar theories, the idea that SpongeBob was created through nuclear testing sounds intriguing, but falls apart once you start looking into it. Berenstein Bear's Mandela Effect. If you've been on the internet long enough, then you might have heard of the so-called Mandela Effect, named after the personal false memories of Fiona Broome, who claims to have heard news stories of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the late 1980s, before finding out that he was still alive when he was released from prison. This point surrounding the Berenstein Bears is the best known example of this phenomenon, as many were surprised to find out that, looking back, the series was actually known as the Berenstain Bears, as opposed to the Berenstein Bears. The existence of these shared false memories has been documented online on Fiona Broome's own personal website, with the notable animation and comic related points including people remembering Curious George having a tail, though in reality he didn't, Warner Brothers cartoons being known as Looney Tunes instead of Looney Tunes, Peanuts creator Charles Schulz having a T in his name where there wasn't really, and the phrase mirror mirror on the wall in Snow White actually being magic mirror on the wall. There have also been memories of films and shows being released earlier than previously thought, with one example on Broome's website being the animated cult classic Flushed Away, which some recall being released sometime before its actual release year of 2006, though personally when I was younger I thought it was released a year later, and it was written whilst the World Cup was happening in real life. I suppose it goes to show that I didn't really know how much went into animation at the time. Anyway, there have been many theories attempting to explain this effect, with the most notable being that our minds were somehow transported from one universe to another, and we remember these previously known ideas from the reality we left behind. Though the most likely explanation would be that this is the result of falsified memories, explained through the theory of reconstructed memory. Emp Lemon referenced this scientific theory in his video about the Mandela Effect's relation to the Fruit of the Loom logo, knowing how our recollection of events isn't exactly a one-to-one snapshot of what really happened in the past, but rather a reconstruction of events based on what your mind picked up in a certain setting. These reconstructions become less and less clear over time, and things could end up being mixed up or falsified in the process. These shared false memories may likely just be the result of these flaws in recollection. People assume that they were called the Berenstein Bears because Steen is a much more common suffix than Stain, similarly to how Schultz is a much more common last name if it has the T. Plus it makes sense why they'd be called the Looney Tunes because, well, they're cartoons. The Mandela Effect continues to be a phenomenon that boggles the minds of many people due to its grand scale, but maybe these events are all really just down to us just remembering things differently. Most of the comics credited to Stan Lee were written by his artists. If you have even an incredibly small understanding of comics as a medium, then chances are you are aware of how impactful Stan Lee was in his long life. While some may only know him as the guy who constantly shows up in those Marvel movies, most are aware of his many contributions to Marvel Comics and other forms of media, being the creator of characters such as Spider-Man, the Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, Black Panther, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, the Silver Surfer, Ego, Thanos, Repeller, etc. A pretty impressive roster for one guy, or at least so it may seem. You see, it's a fairly common belief that the vast majority of Stan Lee's work wasn't really based on his own ideas, but rather was developed by artists such as Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, with Lee coasting off of the success of their creations and gaining much of the credits. This was actually brought up by Lee himself as something he titled the Marvel Method, where by the early to mid 1960s, when he was starting to work on multiple different characters at once, he didn't have enough time to script every single comic that he worked on, so instead he offered artists such as Kirby and Ditko a basic outline of what an issue was supposed to be about, and would then fill in dialogue based around the illustrations they would make. So in that way, it would seem like much of Stan Lee's work was actually carried out by his artists, trying to make the most out of his basic ideas, even though in the end, most people would remember him as the guy responsible for what was actually their hard work. After all, you constantly hear about how important Stan Lee was for his role in the American comics industry, though figures like Ditko and Kirby aren't nearly talked about as much and only really hold passing mentions in most places outside of more dedicated comic discussion circles. So we can conclude that this point is completely true, right? Well, not entirely. Whilst of course Stan Lee is the name you often saw as the face of Marvel, even back in the 1960s, so were the names of people like Steve and Jack, all of which were credited alongside Stan in many of his early comics, and he often spoke highly of them in retrospect. There were however a few additional points that resulted in him getting the fame he ultimately achieved, being that he served as a face of Marvel for well over 50 years, both in the company itself as its editor-in-chief, as well as in the public eye, with his trademark charisma that allowed him to connect with his fans and popularise the industry's involvement in once small independent comic conventions through his eccentric appearances throughout the 70s and 80s. Another point that made Lee stand out, particularly in his later years, was his longevity, as once people like Ditko and Kirby either retired from the industry or died, Lee remained a prominent figure in comic culture, something that exploded around the 1990s and 2000s with the growing popularity of superhero movies, as he essentially became a figure of the old guard for the medium, and functioned as a shared origin point for many superheroes with strong followings across the world. Of course, it's important to recognise the many artists and additional writers who helped to flesh out the groundwork laid by Stan Lee, but they are still nonetheless recognised for their efforts by Lee himself, and its perceived disparity in recognition is likely a result of points outside of anyone's control. Nickelodeon cover for Dan Schneider. This one isn't necessarily cartoon related, since Dan Schneider was mainly involved in live action stuff, but it is connected to a network with a large portfolio of animated shows, so I guess it counts. Anyway, in case you're somehow not in the know, Dan Schneider was an extremely prolific kids TV writer and producer, creating shows such as The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly, Victorious, and Sam and Cat, among many others. He was probably also a bit of a creep. Looking back at the many gags featured in his shows, there's quite an obvious focus on the feet of the mostly child actors, and the scenes involving them just feel off. You could probably say this has something to do with Nick's trademark gross-out humour, but there seems to be a strangely sexual connotation to many of these particular jokes. Something that's made even worse by the fact that he encourages young fans to post pictures of their feet on social media to promote one of his shows. But somehow there's even more unsavoury stuff he's done besides project his potential fetishes on child actors, and encourage unsuspecting underage people to participate in these degenerate fantasies. These include offering auditions to children as young as 13, in which they take off their shoes, talk to a camera about how much they love being barefoot, in fact of course, and then they hang around a pool with Dirty Dan himself, with non-disclosure agreements being signed at these events. The mother of one of the alleged participants pulled her out of the audition, and she was subsequently blacklisted from the industry. There are also allegations stretching as far back as 2002 that Schneider was hosting so-called comedy boot camps with fellow TV producer Brian Peck, who would later be convicted of not doing nice things to multiple underage individuals, before going back to work for people like Disney once getting out of prison, due to a loophole that forbade him from being in direct contact with children, but still allowed him to work on shows starring children. Dan himself was also apparently quite handsy around his actors, and also had issues controlling his anger. There are even rumours that he was the father to the child of Jamie Lynn Spears, whose pregnancy resulted in Zoe 101 getting cancelled, and he may or may not have been responsible for the declining mental health of Amanda Bynes. Yet, despite all those allegations and claims, nothing really happened to Dan. He just continued doing what he was doing. Nickelodeon never said anything about what Dan might have been doing behind the scenes, and very few people were willing to make statements, likely due to the network not willing to put up with the negative publicity surrounding the man who, at the time, was their biggest moneymaker, responsible for hit after hit after hit. This would all seem to change, however, in March of 2018, when Nick severed ties with Dan and his company Schneider's Bakery, which seemed to be around the same time the Me Too movement was making headway and rumours surrounding Dan grew more prominent as more people began to speak out about his alleged past behaviour, likely to a point where Nick was unable to keep the truth covered up any longer, quietly dismissing him without commenting about the allegations to save face. However, there is still the possibility that Dan Schneider was let go for less sinister reasons, the most notable of which being that his shows were dwindling in viewership and were no longer guaranteed moneymakers like they used to be in the past. There's also the point that, outside of anecdotal evidence, there isn't much to work on regarding whether or not Dan even did anything besides, the obvious stuff, which he also apparently claims was all just innocent little fun, which, that's up to you I suppose. The fact that there has been little more information or stories to come out 3 years after he left the network could suggest that this may have just been a case of yet another low-impact online scandal, which the internet has moved on from in favour of the next one. Or, who knows, maybe it's just another example of Nickelodeon covering stuff up, especially since they are still making money off of his IPs. Spider-Man was canonically bad touched as a child. Now this one goes quite deep. This point is referring to a scene that is actually featured in an old PSA comic from 1984, created in collaboration with the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse. The comic features a story in which, after the web-slinger comes across a young kid getting treated badly, he recounts a story of a young man only known as Einstein, and his budding friendship with a man known as Steven, or Skip Westcott, which eventually turns sinister when Skip offers Einstein some unsavoury magazines, and suggests they try to do the things in said magazines, before Einstein makes a smart decision to break away from Skip, and tell his aunt and uncle about everything that happened between them. It's revealed at the end of this, that Einstein was none other than Peter Parker himself, and his recounting of this story and subsequent assistance of this child's troubles, helped him to overcome the fear that this was all his fault, and he's learned to accept that he was a victim in this circumstance. Heartwarming moral aside, there is still the point that Skip, or the whole plot point itself for that matter, is never mentioned again at any point in the series, except for one panel, where Parker discusses his events whilst fighting the Hobgoblin, but that turned out to be from another PSA comic, so the status of both stories in the mainline 616 universe is still up in the air. However, the story was so infamous that famed comic writer Mark Miller stated on a 2004 forum thread that he wants to bring the character back as the appropriately named Buggernaut, Of course though, we have yet to see any of this come into fruition. The Luke Vaber leaks. Oh boy, I've been waiting a long time to talk about this one. Buckle up, buckaroo. This one's gonna be a doozy. In case you don't know, Luke Vaber was a storyboard artist of various different shows, such as Gravity Falls, Steven Universe and Generator Rex. I say was, because many of those who worked with him knew he was quite a pain in the ass to be around. It got to the point that he was effectively blacklisted from the industry, because he spent much of his day sitting on his arse and drawing pictures of him and a Steven Universe character Pearl, getting married and fucking. I mean, more power to you, everyone's got like a cartoon crush, but there's a time and a place, man. Anyway, you might have found some of these elements in this story to be quite familiar, and the word blacklisted might have brought back quite a few memories if you ever seen this video by YouTuber and long-running Encyclopedia Dramatica admin, Easy Peasy, or Odd Guy as he's known on much of the internet. That's because the anonymous tipster in the video turned out to be Vaber himself, according to his official confirmation. In this video, a lot of proverbial beans are spilt about how the animation industry apparently works, at least according to Vaber. Here are a few of the highlights. By the way, I'm going to have this thing flashing up on the screen so I don't have to end every sentence with the word allegedly. Much of the modern animation industry's problems can be traced back to Pendleton Ward, who apparently hired much of the crew from his show Adventure Time from his CalArts friend group rather than seasoned industry veterans, and had picked a bunch of amateur cartoonists from the internet once many of them inevitably got fired. He was also, according to Vaber, a complete pushover with little control over the direction of the story and characters, instead offering a basic premise for each episode and having a storyboard artist fill in the gaps. Now this method in itself isn't necessarily a bad idea, especially since groups like the previously mentioned Marvel Comics have basically been using the same sort of method for decades, and some of the show's strongest points come from the process of coming up with a basic idea and then running with it. However, this also resulted in certain artists with little writing experience using episodes as ways to simply vent their personal issues, creating a bunch of plot lines that were either done away with immediately or suddenly ground to a halt once certain writers left the show, because some other writer wanted the characters to go in a different direction or whatever. Yes, I am still mad. Anyway, additional claims by Vaber would be that storyboardist Kent Osborne once whipped his dick out at a board meeting, and that the character Meow was stolen from an autistic kid, with this being covered up by pretending it came from some character creation contest. This kid apparently must have been one of the youngest JoJo fans out there, because Luke posits that the character was somehow based off of the stand Killer Queen. Ignoring the fact that Luke never worked on Adventure Time, and that Odd Guy is a hardcore fan of JoJo, his points don't end there. He mentions how Steven Universe creator Rebecca Sugar strongly avoided hiring men by writing the show in a specific woman-centric fashion, and the show's well-known Steven Bomb events were created all to keep the show running, so that Cartoon Network would avoid backlash towards cancelling their first woman-led show. Star Versus' creator, Darren Nefsey, was also apparently a pushover, and got a show sabotaged by writer Sabrina Coutinho, who made it her mission to turn all the frickin' characters gay. This may have something to do with the fact that Coutinho herself is a bisexual woman who allegedly stopped dating men after getting an STD from none other than Gravity Falls creator Alex Hirsch. Allegedly, of course, please don't sue me. In fact, Vaber had quite a few things to say about Hirsch, including the claim that he's banged every woman in the industry in exchange for their own shows, that he's given more people STDs than a baker gives away bread, that he gets into fights with people that he suspects are planning to sleep with his objects of desire, and he spends multiple days sleeping in his office and carrying around a porn-filled computer because he can't drive back to his own home. Vaber's points become especially interesting once you take into account the fact that Hirsch was the ex-partner of Owl House creator Dana Terrace, as well as the claim that, by all accounts, Vaber wanted Terrace all to himself, and effectively got cucked by Alex once he came into their lives. Oh, and I almost forgot. Apparently Vaber also once threatened her with an X-Acto knife, like any true yandere would. So, this basically gives us an explanation behind the so-called leaks by Vaber, in that they were all just slander made by some guy who wants to go out and chat shit to get back at his old bosses, and maybe somehow convince a former colleague to sleep with him in the process? I honestly don't know where he wants to go with this, besides a futile attempt to bring about some Comicsgate-style scandal to bring the industry to its knees, which didn't really work because people left, right and centre were calling bullshit as soon as he started talking. However, maybe Luke might be getting somewhere, or could know a few things that we don't. After all, it's basically common knowledge that the entertainment industries are rife with nepotism and demands to fall in line with the norms of a group. Besides, there's been no direct response by anyone in the industry, and honestly neither side has any physical evidence to suggest that any of their points are true, except of course for Luke's self-insert fan art. So for all we know, this could all just be some massive propaganda war where nobody knows what's real and what's fake. Luke definitely seems like a bitter arsehole with anger issues and a persecution complex, but then again it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for such a powerful network of industry professionals to house a dark and seedy underbelly. Case in point, Matt Groening's ties to Jeffrey Epstein. By now you've probably heard of Jeffrey Epstein, the financier who was infamous for being the ringleader in a massive child trafficking network, before being caught, let go, and then caught again before killing himself. Despite this, or maybe even because of this fact if you believe the conspiracies, he also had quite a few friends in high places, the best known of these being political figures like Trump, the Clintons and Blair, but also figures in Hollywood and popular culture such as Alec Baldwin, Mick Jagger and Matt Groening, creator of the revered animated sitcoms The Simpsons and Futurama, as well as a slightly less so revered Disenchantment. Much of the talk surrounding their connection came from an alleged victim of Epstein's, who stated in a deposition that when they were 16 years old and under the hand of Epstein, they recalled once massaging the feet of Matt Groening during a flight on the billionaire's so-called Lolita Express. Apparently they also weren't that well kept, and he offered her 2 drawings of Bart and Homer in return. This point, which has remained consistent in all the interviews she's given on the subject, shows us that not only was Groening connected with Epstein, but he was also fully aware of his child's slavering, and was even offered assistance from these children. Despite these regular mentions in talks with the media, no action or any significant public backlash against Groening has taken place, though this may be for reasons other than just because he's rich enough to get away with it. For one, neither of Epstein's infamous black books featured his contact details, suggesting that if he ever did interact with Epstein, then it wasn't frequent enough for tabs to be kept on him. This is of course assuming that they ever did interact at all, seeing how the only statement regarding a possible connection between them was through a single anecdote by one of Epstein's victims. However, at the same time, the accuser, Virginia Giuffre, would have very little reason to create the story out of thin air, as she is one of Epstein's most notable victims, discussing her past experiences, including this particular event, long before Epstein entered the public consciousness following his second arrest and death in 2019. There's even mention of 2 items, the Bart and Homer drawings, which can function as physical evidence of this whole incident, but until those are disclosed, the occurrence of this event is still somewhat debatable. The Invader Zim Dark Harvest killings. Invader Zim is a show that was infamous for skirting the line regarding what you could or couldn't do on children's television, and no episode exemplifies that point quite like episode 4B, Dark Harvest, which is often regarded as being one of the darkest, go figure, and most horrifying in the entire series. In this episode, Zim continues to try and blend in with human society, and decides that in order to stop people from discovering his alien physiology, he should take the organs of people from around school and replace them with random objects, transforming himself into a grotesque wad of organs for a series of nightmare-inducing scenes involving the process of harvesting these organs. However, despite its infamy, the episode itself isn't the main focus at this point on the iceberg. Instead, it's probably referring to the real-life murder that it apparently inspired. Scott Dulesky, aged 16 at the time of his arrest in 2005, was accused of murdering his next-door neighbour and carving an H symbol into her back. What links these two things together is that Dulesky apparently took an interest in body parts after watching the episode, resulting in the media speculating that he was attempting to try and harvest her organs. Though in reality, one of his defenders clarified that the whole Dark Harvest thing was meant to be a joke, with nothing sinister behind it. In fact, apparently the entire court case around him was quite flimsy, since his alleged victim was married to a notable attorney, and much of his defence was limited in its resources. In addition to this, one of the first results you get when searching up his name is a website proclaiming his innocence, and according to the accounts offered on this site, despite his eccentricities, he was a kind, respectful and talented young man. Regardless, the fallout of this event may have further contributed to the show's continued cancellation, and why Nickelodeon rarely addressed the show's existence outside of a few crossover games. At least, until Enter the Flopus came out, so maybe there is still a future for this show, despite everything that happened around it. The Disney cartoon Porn Vaults. When his show Jake Long American Dragon was greenlit, Jeff Good was sat down by a Disney executive. They proceeded to show him a bunch of Kim Possible porn before telling him, "This will happen to your show." This information was disclosed by someone on Twitter, who met Good whilst they were at a furry convention of all places. This conversation then moved over to Tumblr, where more info was given, stating that according to an individual claiming to have dated an animator, not only did Disney have a repository of X-rated pictures to warn their staff about the dreaded Rule 34, but they even had official pictures of characters made by their own creators. This all stems from a clause in the artist's contract, stating that as long as they were working for the company, Disney legally owned everything their staff created, even outside of the shows or films they were working on. This basically allowed the company to take whatever ideas they wanted from their staff without worrying about lawsuits or claims to plagiarism. However, either out of spite or simply because they didn't care, many artists would end up making porn featuring their characters, with these including characters spanning across Disney's library of IPs, from Mickey Mouse and Snow White to Aladdin and Chip and Dale. All of these were officially owned by Disney, and were therefore subject to the company's policy of placing their personal items in the elusive Disney vaults. Therefore, because of both Disney's scummy business practices, and a disregard for many of their artists being degenerates, the company is now sitting on boatloads of porn created by their own staff, which some have occasionally taken out and photocopied for their own personal reasons. Whilst this would be an absolutely insane discovery if it ever turned out to be true, this whole theory just seems like the Mickey Mouse sex tape theory on steroids, not just because of what it described, but also because of where it's coming from. This whole thing was basically told through one person's perspective, or I guess two if we're counting the whole Jeff Good prelude, with no other information being available anywhere regarding it. Now, would it be possible for artists to do this sort of thing with their characters? Oh, for sure. You just need to dig up a few old posts to know that cartoon creators are very frustrated people. But still, if there was a massive porn vault that could easily be accessed by Disney's artists, then how come there hasn't been a leak yet? I mean, sure, Disney could easily take down anything that got onto the internet, but the combined powers of loneliness and virginity would surely allow people to keep everything up somewhere. Who knows, maybe it's already out there and we haven't realised it yet, going under a bunch of different names, but that's honestly kind of pushing it at this point. The Rugrats Storyboard Jam. Storyboard jams are a small event among the storyboard artists of a TV show, where they all get together and make a storyboard, with each artist adding a few frames to the whole thing. These storyboards are not intended to be actual episodes, and were really meant to relieve stress from all the work on their projects. So with these points in mind, naturally a bunch of crazy shit is going to get written down on these boards. One of the most infamous of these was a sort of lost, sort of found jam from the iconic Nickelodeon series Rugrats, that is sometimes known under the somewhat ominous sounding name of Incredible. According to one of the show's directors, Steve Russell, who brought up the jam on a now deleted LiveJournal post, it started out with, quote, Angelica being a bitch to Tommy, so Tommy gets her a drink in the kitchen and puts in dog food in Drano, before he then toddles back to Angelica. When Russell first receives the jam, he's initially disgusted by it, but goes on to really take it off the deep end, creating the only page that still exists from this board. It involves Tommy about to hand Angelica the drink, before his mum Dee Dee comes into the room and berates him for getting the juice out when he wasn't supposed to. Suddenly, Stu barges in and demands Tommy gives him a tribute and to stay on model as he takes away the juice and threatens him with a beating. This causes Tommy to twitch uncontrollably as he drops malt balls from an unknown location, whilst Angelica and Stu proceed to exchange some uncomfortable dialogue. Russell added far more to the jam than anyone else, and others around him started to think he might have been taking things a bit too far. Still, he continued on, and whilst we don't have the other pages, apparently his extra additions included a shot of Stu's knob surrounded by lightning with the words Balls of Thunder, along with some other things I'd rather not mention. In the end, even Russell himself was disgusted by the stuff he put down, and once he showed it to some crew members for the Wild Thornberrys, the whole thing was confiscated and never seen again. Now, like a lot of things, there's gonna be some skepticism over whether all this stuff was actually added to the jam or not, especially since it's either destroyed or really difficult to find out if this isn't the case, and this might just be the result of Russell trying to sound edgy for his followers. However, this all actually seems quite possible when you take one key factor into account. Steve Russell is probably a nonce, having groomed and made lewd comments to a 16-year-old girl a bit after he worked on Invader Zim, so maybe he might have just been projecting onto the storyboard this whole time, and if that were the case, then I guess we're better off just not seeing the rest of it. The original version of I Was a Teenage Gary. If you could describe SpongeBob with one word, then scary might be one of the last you could possibly think of. Though one of the few times the show actually really came close to that would probably be the episode I Was a Teenage Gary, the second of two Halloween specials for the show's first season. In this episode, SpongeBob TFs into a snail after accidentally giving himself Gary's snail plasma, after which point he goes on to haunt Squidward until he gets the plasma and becomes a snail himself. Now, the episode itself was quite a departure from the normal light-hearted funny ha-has of other episodes, but it was also rumoured that the episode was even darker, with an additional scene where Squidward got transformed in the same way SpongeBob's transformation process went, with much of this rumour coming from the out-of-place looking white between the scenes, suggesting that there was a scene in between these two that was in the episode but was taken out after its premiere for being too graphic, like that matches scene in Just One Bite. However, unlike that episode, there's no evidence that the scene ever existed, and all available online recordings of the premiere showed us it was identical to the episode we're familiar with. Still, the rumours didn't stop there, because some people suggested that the scene did in fact air in places like Poland, which just so happen to be poorly documented areas that often don't interact with English-speaking lost media groups. Regardless, many of those that have interacted with these communities claim that this wasn't the case, and that the episode aired without any changes. So, sorry Cronenberg fans and TF fetishists, but chances are these scenes just never existed. Thrax was created by the government. This theory might initially seem like it's just a joke, based on all those "governments are creating viruses to kill us all" like beliefs that are often thrown around by conspiracy theorists, but there actually might be some level of substance to this whole idea. I'm assuming that this is referring to the villain character in Osmosis Jones, unless there's some other Thrax that I'm unaware of, and one key line stated in this film would be that he made his kill streak into a game, getting faster and faster in his process of killing the people that host him to become the deadliest virus in history.
Yeah, I'm getting better as I go along, baby, but the problem is I never set a record. Until my man Frank, that is. I'm gonna take him down in 48 hours. Get my own chapter in the medical books.
This actually isn't normally the case regarding viruses, which aren't specifically meant to kill the host, but rather are meant to feed off of them and spread more quickly, and having the host be dead isn't really going to help that process. However, there has regularly been fears among governments and individuals that our understanding of viruses could result in a certain governing body using this knowledge to effectively wipe out large swaths of the population, constructing a pathogen that's difficult to treat, but at the same time is capable of multiplying and killing in large numbers. On the other hand, Frax's shortening gap between contact and killing could suggest that, unlike an instinct-driven virus, he's able to learn from his past experiences, like an artificial intelligence. This begs a question though, to what end? Who is creating this viral killing machine, and for what purpose? Well, I've got to confess that I haven't really seen Osmosis Jones all the way through, but from the clips I've watched to look into this topic, there seems to be a strong focus on neglectful hand-washing, as it's mentioned as being a cause for 2 infections by Frax, one of which being for the main human character of Frank. So maybe this could all just be some ploy by the US government in order to get people to wash their hands? I mean, if that's the case then the thought's there, but you kinda lost me on the method. Of course though, there probably wasn't any real intention to infer any of this from the film. Frax was probably just given this motivation to make him a more intriguing villain. Still though, it's all really fun to think about. I think I'm starting to get why people make up all this crazy shit. Only the Alone Garfield Halloween strip is canon. In October of 1989, the Garfield comic strip would see a brief tonal shift for the Halloween season, in which Garfield wakes up to find he's alone. John and Odie are nowhere to be found, and the house appears as if it's been abandoned for years. Maddened by this event, Garfield grapples with his fear of loneliness the only way he knows how, through denial. He proclaims he doesn't want to be alone, and as soon as this happens, he's transported back to his happy place, John and Odie now having reappeared. With this, Garfield goes back to living his everyday life, even if he knows deep down, it's all just a sham. This theory basically means what it says on the tin, in that the only real part of Garfield's canon is this short series of comic strips, with Garfield likely being a stray who took refuge in an abandoned house, creating a fantasy world to cope with his need for companionship. This strip shows us Garfield's brief bouts of realisation before he regresses back into delusion. So basically it's like Garfield minus Garfield, except the roles are reversed. Obviously though, the Alone series of strips probably aren't canon, since as something made for Halloween it'll sort of be like suggesting that Treehouse of Horror is canon to the lore of The Simpsons. Then again, is there even really an actual canon to Garfield anyway? The Thundercats Raw creator was trying to spite siblings with his show. In May of 2018, the internet collectively lost its shit, as it often does, when Cartoon Network announced a reboot of the classic action cartoon Thundercats, named Thundercats Raw. There were 2 key differences though. It was meant to be a comedy, like Teen Titans Go, and the characters looked like this. Naturally, many people weren't too happy about this, especially fans of the 80s original or the previous reboots, and the generic looking character designs basically kickstarted the whole CalArt style meme. Where this theory comes in, however, is through a behind the scenes video released along with the announcement of the show, in which series creator Victor Courtright explains he used to watch the show when he was young, but also that his older brothers were super into it, and as that the show's silly, crazy and outlandish setting lent itself well to comedy. This could probably get people to come up with the idea that maybe this fact is the reason the show is the way it is, in that it's supposed to be bad, either because of some bad blood with his brothers or just because he couldn't understand why they were so crazy about this weird show about these fighting lion things. Though, in all fairness, he was probably just trying to bring back this old show that he liked, and wanted to do something different with it. Shame nobody else seems to appreciate the sentiment though. Toonami was shut down because of tsunamis. There's probably not much to this one. This was probably just added in as a joke. I mean, yeah, basically all of them are added in as jokes, but there's not much you can say to this one outside of, no. Many 90s kids and viewers of Cartoon Network in the late 2000s are well aware that Toonami stopped being a thing because the ratings were too low, which was part of the reason why Cartoon Network did anything in the late 2000s, but still. There weren't really any major tsunamis that came eerily close to the block's closure in 2008, so I can't really bring up anything that would have this theory make more sense. Expect to see more outlandish and I guess dumb theories like this, as we dive deeper down this rabbit hole. Don't Hug Me I'm Scared is about MK Ultra trauma. Puppets count as co-material, by the way. Don't Hug Me I'm Scared is a web series known for its gruesome imagery and interesting themes, exploring them through a parody of a children's puppet show like Sesame Street, and therefore aims primarily at discussing ideas such as media manipulation, thus allowing it to link well with concepts such as MKUltra. Many of these links can be suggested in the first half of the series more overtly, due to the video's firmly delivered messages. Episode 1 about creativity, in fact teaches conformity with regards to what is considered creative by members of authority. Episode 2 about the concept of time discusses how societal norms and values shouldn't be questioned, or else your ears will melt. Whilst Episode 3 about love presents the idea that submitting to authority is the key to love and happiness. These are 3 elements that are needed for an authoritative government to maintain power, and these values are reinforced through subjecting the main characters to traumatic experiences whenever they step out of line, as noted particularly by the end of Episode 2. However, the similarities don't just stop there, as numerous small details picked up by conspiracy bloggers and similar theorists suggest additional links to MKUltra. Key set pieces are highlighted to reinforce this link, most notably through the presence of checkerboard designs throughout the series, which are symbolically used to denote major personal transformations and were commonplace during MKUltra programming. This relation to programming is reinforced through confusion around the difference between reality and fiction, as noted by moments where canonical events take place on in-universe TV screens, as well as the separation of the original and program cells, particularly in the 4th episode. The overlooking character of the yellow guy's dad, Roy, could also function as the group's handler, directing them through their programming. This links into the significance of the date June 19th, 1955, which in that year was Father's Day, and was around the time the MKUltra experiments were first taking place, therefore suggesting that all of this could function as a representation of a group of individuals, with particular focus on the yellow guy who was likely dragged into this by his father, and their experiences and trauma from these harrowing events. Really the whole thing's just a lot to go into, so I'll just link the article that I've worked off of in the description. Still though, despite its depths, this might not be entirely the case, seeing how the show's creators are from the old Blighty, and instead were more concerned with the commercialisation of children's television. As noted by the conflicting messages, which likely represented different companies asserting their products through this medium, whilst the year 1955 represented the year Britain's first commercial television station was launched. Regardless, there's no definitive answer available and the whole thing is just up to interpretation, so perhaps the events of the series were just representative of systemic government brainwashing all along. Again, who knows? The AI making Baby Elsa flash games. If you've seen any of Rev from Vinesource's videos on these things, then you're probably aware of how many of these strange, graphic, copyright skirting Flash games there are, or at least were. Rip to my boy Flash. Relating to characters from the film Frozen, mainly focusing on the main character Elsa. There's like literally thousands of these things, and they all seem to involve a bunch of shared topics. Sometimes it's the normal ones like dress up, but there are also a few that seem to involve things like dentistry and liposuction, you know, the things that all future women definitely need to know about. Outside of these themes though, each one of them seems to be barely any different from one another, like they're all being pumped out by the same small illegal sweatshop in like China or India or someplace like that. There's also the same strange feel to all of them, like they possibly weren't even made by humans, but instead by some AI that's stitching these games together by the dozen on a daily basis. It could certainly explain why there are so many of them out there, but that just begs the question, why? I mean, when you say it like that, then the answer's obvious. Money. Kids come to the site because of the cute, recognisable characters, and the topics interest them, bringing traffic to the website and some gullible 5-year-olds showing up click those free iPhone ads in the process. But whilst a lot of kids obviously want to be doctors when they grow up, I don't think they're really interested in liposuction and whatever else these games have. At least, I don't think they are. Maybe this could all be explained as being tied to the whole Elsagate thing I talked about at the top of this iceberg, what with all the shocking imagery used in them, like the videos, possibly for malicious purposes. But this probably isn't really the case, and these are probably just some guys making a bunch of money off of kids before Disney brings out their cease and desist notes. Still, while we're on the subject of Elsagate, Elsagate is run by North Korea. Think about it. When you think of American pop culture, you probably think of Disney. Their characters are synonymous with the childhoods of children in the West and across the world, and because of the wide-reaching influence of all these characters owned by one massive American corporation, they've been used on multiple occasions as symbols of capitalism and Western imperialism, most notably in a propaganda cartoon by the Japanese in the 1930s. The cartoon shows Mickey Mouse representing America, and he's seen invading and attacking this island before he's defeated by some brave and strong Japanese heroes, a strong subversion of his normal happy-go-lucky attitude in the official shorts. So in that case, there might not be much of a difference between this and videos showing Mickey Mouse's children getting killed in gas explosions, or Elsa and Anna getting kidnapped by Venom. The subjects are different, both when we're talking about the characters and themes, but it seems the intent has changed little since then. The target audience may also be different, since now that the internet allows for this stuff to be easily distributed, this subversive material can now be accessed by Western children, presenting traumatizing imagery to them, and subsequently destabilizing local society by inciting mass panic. It might not be much of a coincidence that discussions around Elsergate just so happen to coincide with the increase in tensions between America and North Korea, with this process of psychological warfare perhaps launching full force to indirectly attack the great imperialist oppressor and his many dominions. However, disregarding how far-fetched this whole theory feels, there seems to be issues with suggesting that these all hail from the confines of Pyongyang, especially when you consider many of the live-action videos appear to be filmed in places like North America and Europe, and many notable creators have been identified, including Mo and Ethan Bradbury. Of course, you could make the argument that they all might somehow be working for the government, which for legal reasons, I must state, I'm not accusing anyone of doing. But regardless, even long after this whole mass panic fell to the wayside, we still don't know what the deal was with all this Elsergate stuff, so for all we know, this theory might still be kind of valid. All Epcot renovations are a distraction to save Figment. At first, this point was a bit difficult to find information on, but I managed to find an explanation from the original thread where this iceberg came from, so I'll probably just work off of that. In case you haven't been to Epcot, or at least haven't been to the Imagination Pavilion when you were there, then Figment was this animatronic purple dragon character who's been part of the park since around the time it opened in the early 1980s, and he functions as an apprentice learning about the wonders of imagination. There were at some point plans to revamp the pavilion to theme it around the characters of Pixar's Inside Out around early 2020. Around the same time though, Imagineers started making a large sum of renovations to the park, perhaps the strangest of these being the replacement of the Universe of Energy Pavilion, with a ride themed around Guardians of the Galaxy of all things. These renovations have helped to redirect time and resources away from the Imagination Pavilion, keeping Figment safe from the winds of change. But why though? What's so special about this particular character that makes him important enough to stay in place after all these years? Is it feared backlash by Scalies? Or does the character hold some deep-seated spiritual significance that we're not aware of? Well, the latter point might actually have some merit to it according to this theory. Now, obviously this animatronic dragon isn't some omnipotent being held captive within Epcot, but its character is tied to it in terms of the spirit of the park. Since the mid-2000s, Epcot's moved away from its focus on basically functioning as a more fun version of a museum, towards focusing much more on Disney's IPs, and general thrill-seeking like other parts in the resort. The Imagination Pavilion is basically one of the few remnants of the old Epcot experience left in the park, so of course many of those with a history around the park would try their hardest to keep this part of it away from the prying eyes of corporate. Obviously, being that this is all behind the scenes stuff, none of this can really be confirmed without exposing some confidential info, but it's still nice to think that there are still some people out there trying to protect the original soul of the park that many fondly remember visiting in their childhoods. A Day with SpongeBob SquarePants. I think this entry should probably be somewhere higher up because of how well known it is, but issues can come up when different people are deciding on where certain entries on an iceberg should go. Anyway, A Day with SpongeBob SquarePants is a tale that needs no introduction, being one of the most infamous investigations in the online lost media space, but in case you're not aware, this self-described unauthorised mockumentary by Innovision Films tells the story of SpongeBob as a Hollywood celebrity whose manager runs a contest to get someone to spend a day with him. The lucky winner is a kid named Seth, who meets up with the world-famous Sponge before hilarious hijinks ensue. This was basically the description offered on the film's Amazon listing, when it first appeared around 2011. It was later noticed by the SpongeBob forum SB Mania 2 years later, before being passed over to 4chan and the Lost Media Wiki not long after that. Since the film was already marked as unavailable by the time this side of the internet got to it, work began in an attempt to track down a copy of the film. What followed would be a series of twists and turns, including the discovery that most of the items of the film's DVD were either fake or taken from other sources, such as the kid in front of SpongeBob's house, who turned out to be from a stock image. In fact, it turned out that Innovision Films was actually a stand-in name for the production company Regal Films, who specialised in low-budget straight-to-DVD documentaries. Oh, and they also have their address listed in the shopping centre's food court, and their website tries to put in a Trojan virus when you try to open it. This, combined with the fact that many people involved with the company refused to speak with anyone regarding the film, alongside claims that many of Regal Films' potential clients were sent to a massage parlour, that apparently also did a bit more than that, caused the search to heat up even more, suggesting that A Day with SpongeBob SquarePants was actually just part of some massive money laundering scheme, or prostitution ring. The search will continue to be thrown off by events such as claims by an alleged former employee on 4chan that the film's premise was completely different from the Amazon description, alongside many false claims of uncovered footage. Eventually the investigation would conclude when search leaders got into contact with a former head of Regal Films, Lorenzo Holly, who stated that the film was at some point worked on and was indeed briefly available on Amazon, but was taken down shortly after to improve the product. Holly would also claim that work on a modified film would take place later on in the year through Kickstarter or a similar platform. However, this was back in 2016, and there's been no sign of any kind of crowdfund for the film since then. Holly's statements would later be followed by the appearance of a man only known as Mr. Orange, who claimed to be behind the concept of the film itself. Key word here being concept, as it turned out the film itself didn't actually exist. Mr. Orange simply offered the idea to Regal Films, and a DVD cover was created solely as a proof of concept, with the cover's features being legally distinct to both pass as parody and also to avoid the watchful eye of Viacom. He says that he still wants to get around to actually doing the film, but nothing's come of that so far. Still, there's some level of mystery in how Mr. Orange completely stopped responding to emails about a month after dropping into the discussion, and his association with the film, if it actually existed, is still largely unconfirmed. So a day with SpongeBob SquarePants might still somehow be out there, but I suppose most people are just perfectly content with leaving the search there, especially since, despite the internet's best efforts, no additional footage of the film was ever found. The attempted sabotage of Toy Story 2. Toy Story 2 is known for being a groundbreaking sequel to an already groundbreaking original film, improving heavily on the animation just 4 years after the release of the first film. However, it's also slightly lesser known as having dealt with a troubled production process, one that saw much of the film being accidentally deleted from Pixar's internal servers, all because some random guy launched a deletion command code on the film's folder. Basically all of it would have been lost if it wasn't for the fact that technical director Galen Sussman had saved much of the assets to a hard drive. If not for this simple fix, the film we know today might have gone the way of the original Food Fight, and according to this theory, this might not be the only link between the productions of these two films. Perhaps this deletion wasn't just some massive accident, but instead another calculated act of industrial espionage. This whole point might start to make more sense when you remember that, whilst Disney was distributing Pixar's films by this point, it didn't own the company yet, and they therefore posed as a rival to their in-house animation studio, which was quickly seeing its early 90s triumphs in the so-called Disney Renaissance, quickly being overshadowed by this new player. Disney's management also previously caused issues by deciding to release the film in cinemas, after the team at Pixar were expecting it to be a lower budget straight-to-video affair, as had been the case for the company's previous animated sequels. This naturally resulted in many crew members undergoing extreme stress, which was further compounded by the film effectively needing to be reworked over the course of just 9 months before its intended release date. This infamously almost saw the loss of one of the animator's children, who was accidentally left in his car due to him being in a mental fog at the time. Most cases of troubled production would lead people to expect the team to either hang up their hat before the deadline, or turn out a shoddy and rushed product that would have been a complete failure for the company. However, despite everything, Pixar was different, and managed to create a film that achieved high praise and grossed $100 million more than its predecessor, and about half a decade later, instead of having wiped them off the field, Disney decided to just buy them out instead. If you can't beat them, join them, or make them join you in this case. You could say this is just another way of inserting the idea that Disney is an evil corporation with no morals into every conversation, but it can help explain the whole reasoning behind this long production process being so uniquely difficult. Gail Simone's giantess fetish. Yeah, I wasn't really sure where to put this one on the tier, so it was up for some weird sex shit. Many Anons on Co have noticed that prolific comic writer Gail Simone seems to really like putting tall women in her comics. Like, a lot. She was the person who gave Giganta a boyfriend in the form of Atom, to really accentuate that size difference, and there seems to be quite a strange amount of attention on the idea of her crushing him in their dialogue, something that Gail herself noted on her Twitter. In addition, despite being an upstanding feminist citizen in much of her work and public life, many of these characters appear to be in rather suggestive situations. This is probably just the artist's fault, but still. To round it all off, there was also a large focus on characters being eaten or almost eaten, which appears to be quite a common trope for those into this sort of thing. I'm pretty sure she's basically alluded to being into this sort of stuff in that Twitter post I mentioned earlier, or at least that's what a lot of Anons would like to think so they don't feel bad about being into super weird shit. Beyond that though, it's probably just one of those things that shows up in her stuff from time to time, but knowing cartoon and comic writers, there's probably something more to this stuff. Mainstream storytime animators work for the government. You ever wonder why it seems that random people suddenly get famous on the internet by doing largely the same thing? Well, what if they're somehow all connected? What if this large network of mainstream storytime animators is linked to one another in a way that we're not aware of? Perhaps this collective of safe, family-friendly, PG, clean content creators was co-opted by both the YouTube algorithm and maybe even the United States government in order to present positive values to the youth in an age of risque and edgy online content being available at the click of a button. Maybe there's a reason this style of content exploded around 2016, a time when edgy meme lords and political provocateurs were making the rounds on the platform, so as to tempt people away from this unsavoury content and create model citizens free from any extreme and potentially dangerous beliefs. Or something like that. To be honest, I made this whole thing up on the spot. I mean, I guess you could probably go somewhere with this, but there wasn't really anything on this whole thing, since it's probably just one of those surface level joke theories, no pun intended. I suppose the reason why earlier storytime animators like Domix and Jane Animations got popular was really just a result of collaborating with multi-channel networks like Channel Frederator, which apparently still exists last time I checked, though I don't personally recall seeing the other ones out as a member when I first heard of him. So maybe that was just YouTube recommendations? I don't really know, to be honest, because it's all really about connections at the end of the day. The craziest leftist comics and cartoons are actually alt-right propaganda. The term black propaganda refers to a type of propaganda technique in which a particular work is distributed in a way from people from one side of a conflict, but presents itself as if it was created by the other side of that conflict to make that side look bad. This has been a tactic in psychological warfare for centuries, and it certainly hasn't stopped in the online age, with this theory positing that it's taking place in often overlooked areas. Have you ever seen a political webcomic with such overblown straw manning and audience lecturing that you end up thinking to yourself, there's no way this isn't some kind of joke? And that's honestly how I felt when I was reading the webcomic Natty, when some woman brutally murders dude bros for catcalling her or something, before they lament about how they deserve everything they're getting and worse. Besides that though, there's also assigned male, with such ham-fisted and confusing moral messages, as well as an equally enigmatic author, that you could easily believe it was also massive acts set up by those evil basement-dwelling alt-writers your parents warned you about. With figures like this being plentiful in the online social justice circle, as you could call it, around the mid-2010s, it's no wonder there was such a strong backlash to this sort of stuff among young and edgy teenagers, and other people who just wanted to play video games, which resulted in some people falling down that old pipeline everyone likes to talk about, though this might have been the end goal all along. But whilst on the surface you could suggest that this argument has some level of truth to it, in reality, if you only dig a fair bit deeper and look at the people behind this stuff, as well as how long they've been doing it, you'll quickly realise that these people are all being completely genuine, only their attempts to present their beliefs or exaggerate them for comedic effect fell flat despite their intentions. Hell, it turns out that the guy who was behind Natty regretted how he got his message across in his comics, and he's since nuked them off the face of the internet. To be fair, there are many far-right comic artists also known for being shit, but despite that, you often see far-righters like Somtos being memed and quoted much more than bread panels, for example. And whilst this is often for the purpose of mockery, it could be tied to the more left-wing comics not being as accessible or subtle enough to fly under the radar as much as the right-wing ones are. In essence, the left can't meme, as the old adage goes. Though, maybe we only really think that because Pole has invaded all political talk, manipulating us into thinking that they're all bad when we don't really give them a chance. Or maybe they're just not up to snuff because the left is too busy hashtag resisting like they always say they are. I don't really know, to be honest. I'm better off moving on. Politics makes me sad. The Callot style is an attempt to promote country-approved homogeneity. Well, so much of that. I don't really suppose I can get into too much detail around this unless I want to get demonetised, cancelled, or both at the same time. What am I talking about? This video isn't being monetised. I guess this is all just meant to be like another surface level joke entry because shows that are often deemed Calots are always shown as being progressive with their messages and their diverse casts, so it seems strange that so many of them carry extremely similar art styles, complete with a signature beam mouth, as if it's all part of some secret ploy to enforce rigidity in our culture. Beyond that though, all I managed to find remotely relating to this theory were some pole-tier ramblings about how the youth are being subverted by the gay cartoon people or some shit. Nothing else really. Moving on. Saki Sanabashi or Go for a Punch. Whilst anime isn't exactly counted as being it is animation, so I guess it counts. Saki Sanabashi, or Go for a Punch, which honestly sounds like some Fist of the North Star knockoff, but whatever, refers to an alleged lost anime film that circulates on the darkest recesses of the dark web.
Dude, this is dark web.
It was first mentioned on the ClearNet by a 4chan user on the X-board, claiming it was one of the most gruesome things that he saw on the darknet. He described it as being cheap and 80s looking, and involved 9 high school girls stuck in a bathroom before they all brutally murder each other after days of being trapped. The graphic nature of these deaths, and the screams they made as they suffered, drove the user to tears, and he apparently cried himself to sleep that night. He claimed that when he found it, it was named something along the lines of Go for a Punch. Whilst most people in that particular thread were taking the piss at the OP for asking a question as dumb as, what was the creepiest thing you saw on the dark web? This particular entry intrigued many people, and the subject will be brought up on X from time to time, with some back and forth also happening with the A-board, with many people suggesting its name to actually be Saki Sanabashi. Later, this search would be revived on Twitter 3 years after it began, by a guy claiming he saw this film that had either of the 2 names mentioned back on 4chan. Then he uploaded a link to a video which he appeared to get excited over, but the video was taken down and it turned out to instead be a guy writing Happy fucking Valentine's Day with his blood. When questioned about it, the guy basically went, oops, must have got that one wrong, before uploading a Dailymotion link that's also gone. This whole search would basically be marked by this sort of process. Somebody presents some kind of lead or basic evidence that the animation existed at some point, but the evidence is either shoddy at best or outright proven to be fake at worst, as was the case of a Reddit user claiming to offer additional insights into the case, before he turned around after a while of egging people on, saying he made it all up. and he then promptly deleted his account so people wouldn't end up getting mad at him. This would apparently even be the case for the OP on 4chan who started this wild goose chase, saying that he was just screwing around in typical Anon fashion in order to get a rise out of OP for his dumb question. I mean, come on, would you really expect an ex-user to have a mental breakdown over a particularly violent anime? Get real. He basically alluded to being untrustworthy just a couple posts in, telling users to proceed with caution on the deep web because it's a, quote, less reliable source of information than shitposters on 4chan. In a Reddit post, he substantiated his claims of being the OP by presenting that the images on these posts were saved on his device just a little bit before they were used in the post themselves. And whilst all this evidence lines up, we can never truly know because that's the thing about 4chan, it's anonymous. So despite the evidence, some started to cast their doubts on the validity of the poster, with inconsistent image file sizes being one of the main arguments. Before long, a small number of people would start the search again, but to be honest, much of the info appears about as inconsistent as the previous claims. In my opinion, Saki Sanabashi probably doesn't exist, but as the legendary writer Mark Twain once said, there's no such thing as an original idea, so chances are maybe someone's come up with the idea in the past, and there might be something really similar out there that isn't necessarily Saki Sanabashi, but could basically count as that considering their similarities. We could get an actual genuine version of Saki Sanabashi at some point if we just dig deeper, but don't hold your breath. Frozen was titled to detract internet searches for Walt Disney's Frozen head. God, that's a mouthful. This next theory is pretty self-explanatory, with it stating that Disney's Frozen, based on the Hans Christian Andersen tale The Snow Queen, was titled the way it was because the film would help to push back information involving the Walt Disney Frozen head theory, which we mentioned at the top of the iceberg, from search results when someone types in something like Disney Frozen on Google or whatever search engine you use. Considering the current consensus of the Disney Frozen head theory, in which most people agree that it's false, this ends up begging the question, why would Disney go to such great lengths to cover something up that, according to the official narrative, isn't actually real? Maybe it could be that Disney's head actually is frozen, waiting to be thawed out in a time of created drought, like today, with the cremation claim being used to cover up this unique feat of scientific achievements. On the other hand, this theory has been discussed by members of the film's team, including its writer and director Jennifer Lee, who claimed that it was referred to as Disney's Frozen for much simpler reasons, in that it reflected the film's theme and also because it was just produced and distributed by Disney. You can still search up for information on the theory with relative ease when you type in something like Walt Disney Frozen or something along those lines. So it would seem weird to go through all this trouble when people could just add another word at the start or end of a search term. However, you could say that this change would easily put off less invested searchers, helping to prevent this theory from spreading more quickly, and therefore stopping the truth of this tale from finally coming out. Elsa Gate is run by Disney. They say no publicity is bad publicity, and this theory suggests that this is true regarding the Elsa Gate controversy, claiming that it was all actually the biggest publicity stunts of all time. It's possible that the reason certain characters like Elsa, Spider-Man, Mickey Mouse and the Hulk appear in so many of these videos is not necessarily because they're popular, but instead because they're either Disney properties or are properties of companies owned by Disney. This therefore makes it seem quite strange when you notice that hardly any of these videos are actually taken down by the Walt Disney Company, because of how they use their characters, despite them being well in their right to do so. I mean, would you want your characters to be seen doing weird sex stuff and eating shit in videos watched by millions of children? Well, apparently Disney's not too chuffed about it. Then again, it did get people talking about their characters more often, which might have been the aim all along, ensuring that no matter what content the younger demographics were consuming, they were always getting it from the hands of the mouse. Some naysayers might say that Disney decided not to do anything because they expected YouTube to do something, but why would they? YouTube just seems to be perfectly okay with offering money to these channels that seem to be siphoning off money from other IPs, whilst also producing such outrageous content around them, despite previously being biased in favour of large corporations compared to no-name channels like these ones when it came to monetization. This could all suggest that maybe these no-name people weren't behind this after all. Perhaps Disney made a deal with them, pushing this objectionable content as a means of helping the company gain enough clicks, to finally allow them to turn that profit they so heavily sought after in the online field. Some could also claim that these weren't possibly made by Disney, because many of them also feature characters not owned by them, like the Minions or the Boss Baby. But really this could all just be part of Disney's grand plan. Their purchase of 20th Century Fox just a couple years ago shows their hunger for any and all properties they could possibly get their hands on, and this likely isn't going to stop at just them. Elsa Gate's strange mishmash of characters from different properties may all just be the first stage in Disney's plans for complete synergy and monopoly in the media space. This is probably all just total bullshit. But since we have yet to know the identities of those involved in these channels, only time will really tell if this is actually the case. The real reason Isaac Hayes quit South Park. Isaac Hayes is a man often known for his career as a soul singer, but for many younger people, He's known the world over as the voice of Chef in early seasons of South Park.
Hello there, children.
Hey, Chef.
How's it going?
Bad.
Why bad?
This of course came to an abrupt end in March of 2006, where a few months after the premiere of the episode Trapped in the Closet, Hayes would announce his intention to leave the show. Hayes was a Scientologist, and since that particular episode dealt with the subject of Scientology in typical South Park fashion, as in not particularly pleasing lights, he stated that working on the show wouldn't be comfortable for him anymore, seeing how the episode felt less like satire and more like a direct attack on his religion. At least, that's the explanation that pops up in most interviews. But he's also mentioned other reasons later on for his departure, like how they didn't pay him enough or that they just weren't nice to him. He actually seemed okay with the depiction of Scientology in the show, just a couple months before he announced his plans to leave.
Sweet tip.
Yeah, one thing about Matt and Trey, they lampoon everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take that shit serious, then I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge for $2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta realize what they're doing.
Yeah, that's what they do.
And take it.
So then, what changed? What was the real reason behind it all? Well, it may have something to do with a much more personal event in his life, this of course being a stroke that he suffered in January that year, which wouldn't go public until a couple of days after he planned to leave. According to his son, it left Hayes unable to speak, and his brain took a toll in a way that made it difficult for him to make independent decisions. Therefore, much of the responsibility fell onto his friends in Scientology, who basically took the leap for him. So perhaps the reason for the sudden change of heart wasn't because he was offended by the show, but rather because the decision was made by someone else, and he wasn't in any position to change that, unfortunately remaining that way until his death a couple years later. So it wasn't because of Scientology, but rather because of his poor health, and also Scientology. The Olsen twins killed Heath Ledger. As you may be aware, Heath Ledger, one of the most legendary of Jokers, sadly didn't live to see the fame that he got from the role, dying of a drug overdose in January 2008, many months before the release of The Dark Knight in which he took a starring role. Or at least, that's what we think, as there's a commonly spread theory that there may have been some foul play involved in Ledger's untimely death, and this whole rumour is based around one Mary Kate Olsen. Shortly before his death, rumours started to emerge that Ledger was in a relationship with Olsen, which quickly developed after the actor split with Michelle Williams. Many initially speculated that he died in an apartment owned by at least one of the Olsen twins, but this was later proven to not be the case. However, that isn't to say there weren't any links to them in the events surrounding his death, as it turned out that when Ledger's body was first discovered by his masseuse, she would call Mary Kate first, before calling the emergency services, which doesn't seem like the best idea when you're dealing with an unresponsive person, but okay. There are even reports that suggested that the masseuse was trying to make multiple calls to Olsen before finally calling 911. I suppose it is important to let one of his friends know about this sort of thing, but calling her this frequently suggests there may be more of a connection than being just friends. This led many to speculate further, in that Olsen was aware of Ledger's substance abuse problem, and may potentially even enable this by purchasing his medication. The fact that she was seeking immunity in the case before coming forward, and was one of the only witnesses who didn't voluntarily offer her accounts of the events, didn't seem to help matters either. The thing is though, is that we don't really know at this point, and much of the investigation seems to trickle off after a few years. Nowadays, the Olsen twins are doing just fine, now being business moguls, with this hitch in their careers now hardly ever brought up. By the way, there weren't really any talks of Ashley being involved, so I guess the theory's name might be a bit inaccurate. Regardless, it's still unknown whether or not there was actually a bad actor involved in the death of this up-and-coming, well, actor. The real Tony Stark has been dead for decades. MCU fans the world over were shocked by the climactic scenes of Avengers Endgame, when the Iron Man himself, Tony Stark, sacrificed himself to reverse the effects of Thanos' snap, erasing both him and his actions from existence, before Stark succumbs to the power of the Infinity Stones and loses his own life. I would say spoilers, but come on, it's been 3 years at this point, where you been? Anyway, whilst this was an impactful moment in the chronology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, fans of the comics weren't really alien to a concept like this happening in the past. When this theory talks about the real Tony Stark, it's highly likely to be referring to the Dimension 616 version of the character, featured in mainline Marvel comics. This version of the character is notable for effectively being killed off in the World's Most Wanted storyline in The Invincible Iron Man, where Stark is hunted down, as his brain contains many sought-after superhero registration documents from that Dimension's Civil War storyline. This concludes with Stark uploading a virus, that deletes the files from his brain, but results in him being critically injured and reduced to a vegetative state. The only way to bring him back is revealed to involve rebooting his brain to an earlier version, which didn't include his memories of the events in Civil War and beyond. This effectively resulted in the death of the real Tony Stark, because now he wasn't the same person he was prior to these events. However, this story was printed in 2009, and the theory specifically mentions decades, plural, so maybe we might need to go back a bit further. There were cases of both Stark's alter ego Iron Man, and the man himself, being involved in fake deaths as far back as the 1980s, but from what I managed to find, this theory is most likely referring to the events of the 1995 storyline Crossing. Here, the character is tricked into performing a string of evil deeds by Immortus and his many later incarnations, becoming a villain who is ultimately killed off when he sacrifices himself to defeat one of these incarnations, Kang, a younger version of Stark, who functions as a major character in the storyline, goes on to take the mantle of Iron Man, remaining that way for a couple years, before the original Tony Stark is brought back by merging him with this younger alternative version of himself, giving him memories from both versions of these characters, therefore meaning that this Tony Stark isn't the same one people have been familiar with for a little over 3 decades at this point. At least that's what I managed to get. These plotlines are really difficult for me to follow. So, when you consider how often events like this seem to happen to the Iron Man, his endgame death ends up feeling less like a unique and groundbreaking event, and more like it's just another Tuesday morning. Well, only a little bit. The Comics Code Authority is still active. The Comics Code Authority, or CCA, was set up back in the 1950s, around a time when comics were generating controversy over their violent content and alleged links to a rise in juvenile delinquency. In response to this outcry, comic publishers came together to create a regulatory code free from government interference, functioning like how the Hays Code did for films at the time. Under the CCA, excessive graphic violence and sexual content was forbidden, as was cursing, kidnapping cases, depictions of zombies and other supernatural figures, plotlines where the bad guys win or go unpunished, and sympathetic depictions of villains, outside of presenting moral debates. Even the words terror and horror were forbidden from comic titles, and the word crime would always be downplayed. The difference between this and the Hays Code was that, since this wasn't legally enforced, following the code was entirely optional, and many publishers such as Warren Publishing, and the numerous independent publishers in the underground comics movements, would opt out to create much darker, risque and less restricted comics, at the exchange of being less widely distributed. The CCA would continue to evolve with these comics, as well as the rest of popular culture during the 70s and 80s, relaxing their restrictions towards depictions of supernatural and violent scenes, to bring about an age when comics became significantly darker. By the 2000s, the code was little more than a formality, and when advertisers stopped targeting CCA-approved comics, the code was quickly retired. Marvel shifted away from the code in favour of a rating system, similar to the MPAA or ESRB, as would DC Comics years later. The last of the major CCA publishers to pull out was Archie in 2011, thereby leaving the code completely defunct. Despite this, the code never formally ended. All the major publishers just simply pulled out. Or at least that might be what they claim, so as to simply appear less old-fashioned by using such an archaic system of regulation, which might be what this theory is referring to. One thing about this whole chart, however, is that since it's about 2 years old, it might not have expected this theory to actually come true. Around the summer of 2021, a small comics publisher, known as Binge Books, started publishing its work under the approval of the CCA. Whilst this might have just been added to give it a sort of retro feel, it's interesting to see this theory evolve away from simply being crazy conspiracy rambling. The Summer Camp Island Drowned Child. Anyway, back to crazy conspiracy rambling. A fairly recent series to bring up, Julia Potts' Summer Camp Island involves a bunch of anthropomorphic animal kids hanging out in a summer camp led by a group of witches, where a bunch of magical things happen. You can chill with the many monsters that live there, and make friends with the sun and moon whilst taking in all the enchanting and magical items that dot around the island, including the ice cream, as was the subject of the episode Ice Cream Headache. In this episode, the main character, Oscar, tries to get some of the camp counselor's ice cream to get everyone through a heatwave caused by a particularly angry sun. He then comes across this flavour of ice cream he was told not to have, which when eaten by the group, gives them all superpowers. That is of course except for Oscar, who's lactose intolerant, and the episode basically involves him overcoming the idea that he doesn't need to have superpowers to stand out among the crew. But that's not what we're talking about here. Instead we're going to be focusing on this scene where the kids get their powers, with all them showing them off, except for this one background character, who believes that he's now able to breathe underwater. This kid then runs off to see if this is the case. He's then never seen again for the rest of the episode, and from what I've heard, never again in the rest of the series, with this theory stating that this implies the kid drowned trying to see if he had these powers, which clearly he didn't. Now, I can't say for sure if he never appears again in the rest of the show so far, since he's a nameless background character with not much to go off of, and the only way I really know is if I watch every episode of the series and carefully analysed every single scene. So in this case, I might as well take this Anon's word for it. After all, when has someone ever lied on the internet? The non-family triggers brain reformatting. Okay, I know this is not on the main iceberg, but I just got to talk about this. So, about a year ago, there were these ads on 4chan for this cartoon on YouTube called The Non-Family, involving these people in a vaguely South Park-like animation style, getting together and throwing a birthday party for this lady who got her eye gouged out by a rock. The original version of the video is in Russian, but the version that was spread around 4chan was an English dub that is, for lack of better words, total shit. None of the lines match up with the mouths, the delivery feels painfully disjointed, and this is combined with the original animation's inconsistency between wanting to directly copy South Park's blocky cutout animation and doing this really weird motion tweening, alongside this whole episode's plot feeling like it was just written by an AI. When you combine all these factors in the English version of this video, you get something that feels incredibly alien and leaves you in a state of confusion so strong that it feels like your brain is being tampered with as you watch it. Both the Russian and English versions of this video were made by channels with no identifying information, so the creators, and their reason for creating these videos, are both unknown. That's where this whole theory comes in. According to this theory, the confusion you get whilst watching it is actually a case of MKUltra style brain reformatting, with the audio and certain visuals, such as that red balloon, being present specifically to send coded signals to your mind to ensure that you're reprogrammed to become a more complacent member of society, which could probably explain why it was advertised and later shilled all over the infamous racist hacker collective 4chan. People out there wanted you to see this video. The purpose of this animation remains a mystery, but from what it contains, it seems possible that this purpose isn't necessarily for your benefit. To be fair, this could all just be a shitty cartoon that was shilled constantly on the old basket weaving forum, and its creators purposefully built a mystery around this while shilling it, because they knew how inhuman it felt. But despite all this, the mystery still remains. Bugs Bunny is a real, self-aware Native American spirit. Within mythology and contemporary fiction throughout the world, there are examples of rabbits functioning as crafty tricksters. Ancient examples would include Kalulu of Zambian mythology, or Meitotli, if that's how you pronounce it, the Aztec god of drunkenness, and Nanabozo, an Ojibwe spirit, who occasionally takes the form of a rabbit. This folklore would serve as a basis for more contemporary characters, such as Peter Rabbit, Brother Rabbit, and most notably Bugs Bunny. The near-universal presence of these characters in cultures around the world has led many to speculate that there may be some kind of link between these depictions, suggesting that this Native American rabbit spirit is an actual being beyond human comprehension. This therefore gives us a claim that Bugs Bunny, a character with strong connections to Nanabozo, is a real spirit that appears as the rabbit form of this being, as centuries-old depictions of the figure appear largely similar to that of Bugs Bunny nowadays. Some even crazier theories suggest that Nanabozo has taken the form of the old mascot for Land O'Lakes butter, and the Dorst effect of repeating imagery on the packaging is used as a portal by the being from the spirit world to our own, suggesting that he may be roaming among us now, and is aware that we know of his existence, but having him function as the inspiration for one of the most widely known cartoon characters of all time. We'll talk more about this stuff later, as we traverse further down into the depths. The Secret Saturday's Weird World commercials are real. In 2008, to promote their new series, The Secret Saturdays, Cartoon Network had a series of commercials containing purported home video footage of real cryptid sightings, before directing the audience to a website for more information. A fairly unique way to advertise a kids show in the late 2000s. Since the network was marketing this footage to an audience that didn't know what special effects were and had probably just stopped believing in Santa Claus, it would be easy for many of them to believe that this was real, which according to these YouTube comments was certainly the case for some people. But what if they had the right idea all along? Whilst this all may look like CGI to us, our limited knowledge of cryptids leaves open the idea that this may simply be how they move and appear in real life. Maybe these could be some of the few examples of actual cryptid footage out there in the world, and this footage was placed in these commercials both because it worked well for marketing, but also because this method of broadcast would likely attract the least suspicion and therefore slip past the powers that be. But even if that were the case, how would a network like this have access to this sort of stuff? Well, that can quickly be answered once you remember that Cartoon Network is owned by the same company that also runs one of the most viewed news channels in the world. It wouldn't necessarily be unheard of for people to bring in home video footage that they think might be newsworthy, but the only thing they didn't consider was the high chance of suppression by the governments, therefore leaving it in an archive somewhere, later to be found by some guys making a show about cryptids. So maybe it could all just be Hollywood effects and nothing else, but since what we know about cryptids remains minimal and locked away, the possibility remains that these commercials could be hiding this long sought after footage in plain sight, just waiting to get the recognition it needs. The hentai reboot of My Life as a Teenage Robot by Gainax. If there's one animation company out there that's known for well-animated fighting robot action, it's Gainax. Creators of Evangelion, Pantheon Stocking, Tengen Topper Gurren Lagann, and Fully Cully, among others. This made them seem like the ideal candidates to bring back a show like the cult classic Nicktoon, My Life as a Teenage Robot, which still holds a strong fanbase over a decade after it was cancelled by the network. Naturally, this has resulted in many hardened efforts to bring the show back in some capacity, something that many fans, including the team on MLAATR Rebooted, had tried doing themselves. However, it seems possible that the adventures of Jenny Wakeman and the team at Gainax may have almost come together in the past. According to rumours circulating over the internet, the studio is planning to negotiate with Nickelodeon over potentially buying the rights to the series to allow them to give it that continuation that people have been waiting for years. It's unknown if this was meant to be a complete reboot of the show, or an extra season from when the show left off. But whatever it was, it seems Nick just said no to the whole idea, leaving people longing for what could have been. Now, you may be wondering, where does the whole hentai thing fit in? Nowhere. The guy who brought this thing up must have gotten things mixed up in a coon-brained haze or something. Nick Slime discovered a NASA Apollo 17 mission. Almost half a century ago, man took his last steps on the moon, and some pretty well-known pictures too. Since then, he has remained bound to the confines of the Earth and its surroundings. But for what reason? Well, the official narrative is that NASA did what they needed to do, and it would be a much better idea to put taxpayer money towards more productive things, rather than blow billions of dollars on taking a few people to the moon. But that's too obvious of an answer. Alternatively, a popular theory alleges that the reason we haven't gone back is because we never went in the first place, as our technology was and still wasn't advanced enough to make the journey, and the footage was fabricated to get the space race over with. But that's a bit boring too. Instead, what if this could all be because we saw something that we weren't meant to see on that final mission? Something organic, perhaps? Well, whatever it was, it seemed like it was enough to convince the US not to return to the moon after consistently travelling there. But since this event saw us catch a glimpse of extraterrestrial life for the first time, its likeness would likely be relayed to us over many decades to prepare us for extraterrestrial contact, a concept explored in the 2011 sci-fi epic, Pull. This all began with its appearance on a local children's television show 7 years after the mission, before becoming a mainstay on the certain network that picked the show up a few years later. We can't say for definite if Nick Slime was based on alien matter, but with NASA's space program being as low profile as it is, mysteries behind the curtains may still remain. Alan Moore met John Constantine. Alan Moore, one of the most famed comic book writers in the industry, whose many works in the 1980s subverted the superhero genre and took it in a much darker direction, creating comics such as V for Vendetta, The Killing Joke, and The Watchmen, with a slightly lesser known but still extremely notable creation of Moore being that of the snarky and cynical detective John Constantine, who would go on to enjoy popularity in his own right in the nearly 4 decades following his introduction. However, there is one key point about Constantine that makes him stand out from other cunning anti-heroes, in that many writers for the comics he appeared in, including Moore himself, claim to have seen the character in real life. This isn't meant to be a metaphorical thing in which Moore first got the idea of the character from someone he knew in real life. No, as in he literally came across the character he wrote about multiple times. Well, by multiple I mean 2, but still. The first of these encounters was recounted in an interview with Wizard magazine in 1993, in which Moore claims to have witnessed his character at a sandwich bar, donning a trench coat, a short haircut, and a physical appearance that meshed better with his character than that of the police frontman Sting, whose likeness served as the basis for Constantine's appearance. The figure looked directly towards Moore, nodded slightly and went off, with Moore choosing to keep to himself rather than pursue this individual. They were crossed paths a second time during Moore's performance of an occult ritual, in which Constantine steps up to him and whispers the key secret to performing magic. Anyone can do it, though he was apparently a bit more vulgar. These aren't just limited to Moore's personal experiences either. Jamie Delano, Peter Milligan, and Brian Azzarello all claim to have encountered the character in the wild at different points in time. The explanations behind these apparent encounters are minimal, but some suggest that this could be an example of writers and creators all being extremely invested in their creations, and seemingly willing them into existence through their own personal lenses, like a tulpa. An understandable idea, considering that all the writers who encountered him have worked on comics and similar works starring Constantine, including his main comic, Hellblazer. Alternatively, however, we could explain these encounters using Moore's previously mentioned ties to occult practices, something that's shared with his character, which could allow them both to break through boundaries between worlds, suggesting a link between our world and the worlds we perceive as fiction, something we'll touch more on later. Batman is based on a Mesoamerican warrior. Similarly to the likes of Bugs Bunny, the Cape Crusader, Batman, has a history of inspirations that dates back to ancient mythology, with the character's strong connections to the monstrous creature of Kamatzots of Mayan legend. This being possessed a body similar to a human, the head of a bat, and a nose reflective of the appearance of a flint knife. The being plays a pivotal role in the events of the Mayan scripture of Popol Vuh, again, sorry if I butchered that, in which they function as one of the many creatures responsible for the extinction of the first humans in the age of the first sun, and as also the being that slayed the noble hero Hunapu. Many suggest the character to be based on fears surrounding the vampire bat, or perhaps even its larger and scarier ancestor, with these types of beliefs being commonplace in cultures around the world, the bat often being associated with danger and death due to their nocturnal nature. These traditional fears carry themselves into more contemporary culture, again like Nana Bozo and similar rabbit-like figures, with these perceptions of bats morphing into characters such as the deceptive and bloodthirsty Count Dracula, and the infected vampiric humans in I Am Legend and its later adaptations. It wouldn't be a stretch to suggest that these traditional ideas of the bat melded well into this brooding and hardline anti-hero, who often performed his duties at night. Of course, he's not murdering innocent people like the figures that came before him, but the basic traits of his personality still seem to have come from somewhere. The Simpsons didn't predict anything. Everything was already decided. Whilst this may appear out of left field for those who are still trying to get into the whole idea of the Simpsons writers being prophets of future events, this point is actually the basis of most theories surrounding predictive programming. If we were to accept the idea that certain forms of popular media, whether that be film, television, video games, comics or some other formats, are able to predict future events, then in order to understand these theories we need to explore the why. Why do the media offer these many predictions of future events? Well, according to this explanation, they don't. All these major catastrophic events are orchestrated by governments or some secret society, and they use their branches in the media to condition people to prepare for these events when they come into existence, as apparently spontaneous disasters. This basic theory has been explored in shows and films such as 2013's Utopia, and may have even been inferred by documentarian Adam Curtis in his film Hypernormalization, which dictates how bankers control everything that happens in the world, and that politicians are simply looking for problems to go after so as to justify their continued existence. A theory that, whilst not exactly connecting with this idea, serves well as the basis for a concept such as predictive programming. Now this is far removed from the simple show theories that we had at the start of this iceberg, and you could suggest that we've reached levels of conspiracies that you'd often hear from the ramblings of a homeless smack addict on the streets of LA. But the craziest thing here is that, whilst we've reached the end of the iceberg itself, we still have 3 whole tiers left to go, ones that will further alter your perceptions of not just the medium, but of reality itself. The rabbit hole only goes deeper. Cartoons were invented by Cro-Magnons. Cro-Magnons may sound like some kind of evil alien race when you first hear the name, but in reality they're simply the scientific name given to early humans who were among the first to settle in Europe, living alongside Neanderthals from around 50,000 to 35,000 years ago. This stage in human evolution saw many developments in the minds of these beings, as they started producing tools, art, and sculpture on a grand scale. Among these were examples of what could be described as early attempts at cartoons. Originally I thought this was just referring to those cave drawings like those ones of horses in Lascaux in France, as those could count as cartoons the same way newspaper comics or political drawings could count as them. However, whilst I was recording this video, I heard about how there are many cave drawings that depict animals with multiple heads or limbs, alongside examples of multiple drawings of similar animals in a video by Try the Explainer. These drawings, which back during their creation could only be viewed lightly one at a time using a weak firelight, could end up giving the illusion of motion when looked at in a particular order. This hypothesis could therefore suggest that these cave drawings are not just standalone pictures for other members of your tribe to look at for a bit, but rather they were early attempts at animation for people to experience. And in that sense, you could say that animated cartoons have been a concept for thousands of years before even cameras were invented, and they all started with primitive folk drawing things in caves, unless of course, some other race of beings put them there. Every little girl is a kind of cheese. Yeah, prepare yourselves for this one. So, if you've been knocking around DeviantArt for a bit, checked out the bad DA art accounts on Twitter, or browsed any cringe or autism thread on Co, then there's probably one username that caught your attention at some point. Molly Hale was my friend, also known by his real name of Eric Mokrachek. On his 5-year-old accounts, you can find over 4,600 images, most of which featuring some interesting specialist subjects, including but not limited to old game shows, shopping centres, department stores and toy stores from the 80s, local TV stations, and a small selection of young cartoon characters from the 80s and 90s, sitting in their backs of cars eating fries, or standing at desks and playing with toys at school. If you couldn't tell by now, Eric's an autistic man who's been making these things probably because he's still trying to hold on to his childhood. However, this isn't all that he's done. Before his current DA page, he had a YouTube channel with large swaths of videos that are almost all completely lost, and he would often upload lyrics to song parodies, some of which he may have even sang himself on his channel. One of these would be the elusive Every Little Girl Is a Kind of Cheese, a parody of the song Life as a Rock But the Radio Rolled Me by Reunion. I couldn't find the lyrics to it anywhere. All I managed to track down was this parody video that's basically unintelligible because it's using this text-to-speech program that's going like super fast. But I guess it involves taking a girl's name followed by a name for a kind of cheese that sounds sort of similar, I guess. Like a lot of things Eric makes, it's all kind of strange. But that's not all. Within the long backlog of pictures up on his DeviantArt account, there's this picture of a VHS tape featuring a film with the same name as a song. The details of what the film would involve are a mystery, outside of its name and running time. This may all be yet another figment of Eric's imagination. But what if it was all real? What if the reason he's created all the specific stuff is because maybe somewhere out there, perhaps beyond our own world, he's seen these things play out? What if his company of classics is a real thing somewhere out there in a multiverse, and all these images are manifestations of items from another reality? In all seriousness though, don't go after this guy. I know the name of the song might sound a bit nonce-ish, but I think this is all just part of his childish sensibilities and autistic fantasies, so you don't need to worry about him. Of course though, we still don't know what he meant by this, so the meaning of the phrase, every little girl's a kind of cheese, and all the content relating to it, shall continue to remain a mystery. Alan Moore's serpent cult. I've mentioned previously about Alan Moore's connections to the occult and similar spiritual beliefs, but perhaps one of the most interesting things about him is that he's taken to worshipping the serpent god Glykon, an ancient figure with history dating back to 2nd century Rome. The deity was worshipped by a large group of people back around the time of its creation, and was based around the story of a snake that foretold the reincarnation of the Greek medicine god, Asclepius. This god would then take the form of the snake, causing it to develop human ears and long locks of blonde hair. Some say that the idol the cult regularly worshipped was an actual snake, whilst many believe that it was instead just a hand puppet. The cult was a subject of mockery by Greek satirist Lucian, and it would ultimately die down in popularity after the death of its founder, Alexander of Abernethycus. Moore has stated that he doesn't actually believe that Glykon is real, saying that he would much rather prefer to worship a hand puppet god that he wouldn't end up believing is the real thing. It all ties back to his idea that people don't need to follow a singular idea of a deity, and it should be up to an individual's personal choice as to which higher power they intend to follow, and how they personally interpret the universe, saying that everything people talk about regarding magic is true, within their own minds. Everything's relative, basically. In addition, Moore has been in the process of writing a book based around his beliefs, titled The Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, for over a decade at this point, though its future is unknown, as his co-writer for the book and fellow occultist, Steve No Relation Moore, died in 2014. Still, it's never been completely cancelled, and it may be possible for the small belief system surrounding Glykon to morph into a cult of its own someday. Steve Ditko was an idea. Basically everyone who knows about Marvel Comics knows about Stan Lee and his eccentricities, but few realise that, especially later in his life, Steve Ditko, co-creator of Spider-Man, was a bit of a character himself, perhaps literally so if this theory is anything to go by. Besides his notability in creating Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, Ditko is also known for being a fair bit of a recluse, with very few pictures or audio circulating that feature him.
Hey, what's all that commotion out there, Sol?
Why, it's Shy Steve Ditko. He heard you're making a record and he's got mic fright. Whoops, there he goes.
Out the window again? You know, I'm beginning to think he is Spider-Man.
You mean he isn't?
He was also known for his eccentric and flip-flopping beliefs. For example, much of his work on Doctor Strange had been embraced by hippies around the time of its creation, as the imagery featured within it suggested it was created with the aid of LSD. However, at the same time, Ditko was a hardcore conservative, and a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophies. This, combined with his outright refusal to be involved in anything surrounding the public eye, could lead many to suggest that Steve Ditko was never really a person at all, but instead a pen name of sorts for a specific method of drawing that was perfected by a whole bunch of different people, rather than by a single individual. All this extra stuff around him was probably just added by Stan Lee and his gang to give the character his own identity. But didn't he die, I hear you ask? Well, I suppose he did in a way, though this may either be the death of the character, or simply the death of one of his actors, likely the one who appears in all those pictures of him. This actor, or maybe some different people, may have also been the voice of Ditko in all those interviews and phone conversations he gave later in life, which were also how we learned that he never got any royalties from the Sam Raimi films when they were coming out. This clue may help us explain why Marvel would take this route in the first place. Perhaps Stan Lee was taking credit from his artists the whole time, having them all go under a singular pen name so that they can't be credited, and therefore weren't likely to demand royalties in the future. If this whole Steve Ditko theory were true, then it's anyone's guess as to how it would have all worked, but I suppose that's what makes this whole thing about as elusive as the old guy himself. Hafnim. Hafnim is a term that's shrouded in mystery, being spread around on occasion on Co, carrying many themes whenever it's mentioned, but what it stands for is completely unknown. Many have gone mad trying to figure out what it entails, but the most likely definition I could find was something along the lines of heterogender fetish normative integrated media. Basically, this implies that people create cartoons to vent their weird fetishistic interests, even if these cartoons are intended for children. Dan Schneider's work may be a live-action equivalent of this, but when discussing animation, one of the most common examples brought up would be the 2016 Powerpuff Girls reboot, which occasionally features the characters doing things like twerking and getting really fat. The latter of these is also often associated with the phrase, with people claiming that Hafnim instead stands for huge animated fat nerd in motion. However, in the original thread discussing this phenomenon, much of the conversation was shaped around people like Jake Goldman, a writer on a show who was infamous for appearing to insert himself as a character Jared Shapiro, who functioned as Blossom's love interest. Interestingly enough, Goldman would also confidently state in an interview that his favourite character is Blossom, before proceeding to wipe something off of his forehead. It takes a very unique type of adult to create entertainment for children, but the extent to this uniqueness might be quite a disturbing topic to cover, and his strange qualities may all be a key contributor to the continued existence of Hafnim in today's media. We are former K&D operatives. The show codenamed Kids Next Door may initially seem like it's just a fun show with a unique premise based around the whole hating adults thing kids tend to do, but many of those who watch the show may be aware of the deep lore hidden underneath this basic premise. Despite how passionate many of the kids are in taking down the supreme leadership of adults, they can't stay that way forever, which is where the concept of decommissioning comes into play. When an operative reaches their 13th birthday, they're taken to the K&D moon base and are wiped of all their memories relating to their service in the Kids Next Door, going on to live boring lives as the adults they so heavily resented during their childhoods. Some of them might be recommissioned for a bit, like Number One's dad, but most of them aren't so lucky. Another key part of the K&D's operations is that their war with the adults is, to most people, a closely guarded secret, with historical events like the moon landings being faked to cover up their moon base, for example. Therefore, who's to say at one point in the past, we were never members of the Kids Next Door? According to the logic of the show, just because we don't remember our time in the Force doesn't mean it didn't happen. We could have been great heroes back in those days, and we'll never truly know unless we somehow got recommissioned. It's a sad thing to think about, but such is the life of a K&D operative. Family Guy is the last cartoon. Now, in a literal sense, this phrase obviously isn't true. After all, we've had about 2 decades of new content come out after Family Guy premiered in 1999. Instead, it's more likely referring to the idea that Family Guy, and by extension the rest of Seth MacFarlane's work, is the final stage in the evolution of the Western cartoon medium. Ever since the first theatrical shorts were created by groups such as the Walt Disney Company, the boundary as to what can be done for animated content has been pushed more and more, shifting away from a focus on fluid animation in exchange for humour based around a show's writing. Following Disney's original Mickey Mouse shorts, Fleischer Studios will go on to develop in popularity, offering more of a focus on dialogue and slightly more mature writing through characters such as Betty Boop and Popeye. Then came Warner Bros.' Looney Tunes, which weren't as dynamic as Disney or Fleischer, but made up for it with writing that appealed more to all ages, rather than Disney's target audience of children. This continued further on with the rise of television and the premiere of shows like The Flintstones, which gave us a more relatable, albeit still out there setting, to further connect with that adult demographic. It would then be followed by The Simpsons, a show that shocked audiences nationwide with its much more direct and rebellious sense of humour. Family Guy took these factors in The Simpsons and amped them up to 11, going all out on shock humour in exchange for a mostly simplistic animation and design style to accentuate the writing in the show. Following the show's premiere, the style of writing and animation has remained a standard for shows like it, with hardly anywhere else to go, because there's nowhere else to evolve beyond that can make it past the censors. So why don't all those other cartoons count? Well, it's either because their inspirations draw from earlier stages in the medium's evolution, or they could be more influenced by anime, especially nowadays as overarching plots become a mainstay in other contemporary shows. Therefore, Family Guy remains as the final, or at least the most recent, undiluted step in the evolution from the older, self-contained and humour-driven productions that came before it. My Little Pony is the modern-day Great Awakening. Like the previous point, this theory probably shouldn't be taken at face value, especially since it's very difficult to link My Little Pony to the historical ways of evangelical Christianity in the United States. Instead, we need to primarily focus on one word: awakening. The word is most often used in a Christian context, in which a mostly secular population becomes closer to religion, but the phrase can also be applied more abstractly, to a realization or a revival in interest. It's possible that we could apply this latter definition to the rise of the so-called brony community, originally sprouting up from a small number of ironic viewers of My Little Pony Friendship's Magic on 4chan, before many more people started to watch the show and genuinely enjoy it. In the early days of the fandom, there were often points where both casual viewers and detractors of the fanbase started asking questions like, is it gay to like this cartoon for girls? With a subsequent crisis of identity, resulting in many people feeling reaffirmed once they managed to overcome these questions. The fact that this cartoon has captured the interest of tens of thousands of young men, subsequently altering the beliefs and ideas of many of them, it could be easy to suggest that this show has seen the coming of what could be called a Great Awakening. Now, we have yet to see if this forms into a genuine religious movement, which seems less likely as mainstream interest appears to have died down after the ending of Friendship is Magic. But as the fanbase remains strong in certain avenues such as the MLP board, with the inception of G5, only time will tell if something bigger comes of this, possibly as part of our next points. Chris Chan is sane. Guess you could tell this was written over a year ago, huh? So you don't need me to explain to you who Chris Chan is, the creator of Sonic, who's been on the downward spiral for the past decade and a half, and is now in jail awaiting trial after getting done for fucking his mother. But we're not going to be touching much on that last bit. Instead, we're going to be focusing on this belief system around Chris that's emerged recently, that's effectively akin to a cult. After a group of trolls extorted money out of Chris, in which they claim to have access to the universe in which his characters exist, he would then start to make claims that, for the protection of the multiverse, our dimension, 1218, would merge with its sister dimension, C197, which is not only where his Sonic characters live, but it's also the home to every single fictional character present within this dimension. Originally announced in October of 2018, with the expectation that it would happen in December, Chris would later explain that the merge was being prevented by some red tape, held together by some evildoers. He would continue to change the date of the merge, like a doomsday cult leader pushing back the Day of Judgment, and many more events were going to take place, such as Chris's polyamorous marriage with his OCs and Mewtwo, his revelation that his spirit comes from that of a princess on a faraway planet, who was later cast out, in an origin story that's basically a knockoff of Sailor Moon. And during much of the Great Pandemic, he spent much of his days pretending to be Sonichu, whilst his spirit went off to attend a Brony convention in C-197. This brings us to the ongoing prison saga, where according to letters sent out by Chris, he now claims to be the living incarnation of Jesus Christ, and stated the reason he was doing that stuff to his mum is so he could engage in soul bonding, to purify her spirit for the upcoming merge, which is now only moments away. Whilst at this point you could suggest that these events have resulted in Chris's beliefs appearing no different from your typical schizophrenic, there's still the possibility that Chris wasn't making this all up. We can't exactly disprove many of his beliefs, in that there is another universe that's about to collide with ours, that Sonichu has possessed his body for over a year, and that he is indeed the great CPU goddess Blueheart, and simultaneously God Jesus. And it may be possible that all these potential inconsistencies in these revelations are simply just part of Chris gaining clearance, as he comes to terms with his true and honest reality. I mentioned in the Bugs Bunny and John Constantine theories that I'll explore a particular topic later. This is that topic. The dimensional merge functions as a missing link to both of these theories and many others like them. Bugs and Constantine are both indeed real. Chris even confirmed the former in one of his videos. They're just separated by some red tape and an iron curtain, waiting to break through into our reality full time. Chris mentions that the merge is completing and concluding in his many prison letters, suggesting that C-197 is fully prepared for its fusion with 1218. Only the failing Earth of our reality has yet to take the final leap. The real Luke Faber leaks. Luke Faber's leaks offered us plenty of insights into the goings-on of the modern animation industry, but they may not necessarily be complete, particularly with regard to visual proof of these events. These missing pieces may be explained through the existence of certain other leaks, ones that are either not out there, or are located in the deep recesses of the dark web.
Dude, this is dark.
Currently unable to be located, as exposing these may either cost Faber his chances of employment anywhere, or even his life. One can only speculate what these leaks may entail. They could include the raw footage of the Weird World commercials, evidence of Hafnim being cultivated in the writers' rooms, or even footage of the portal to C-197, where all the creators get their ideas. We might never know if these additional leaks are out there, but the allure of uncovering industry secrets remains potent. Unreleased Calvin and Hobbes TV show. Bill Watterson was in many ways a purist when it came to where he was willing to stick his characters' faces. His world-famous comic strip duo, Calvin and Hobbes, would remain restricted to the funny pages, with the exception of a couple books and a calendar or two, during the strip's 10-year run, after which Watterson would retreat into a life of privacy after he did what he wanted to do. Unlike contemporaries like Jim Davis, Watterson maintained the idea that his characters should stay in comics and vetoed any attempts at offering a license, believing that it would ruin the strip's integrity by turning his characters into just another product, and he believed the characters' oversaturation would cause them to be resented as a result. However, one potential exception to all this could have been a possible cartoon adaptation of the comic, as noted in a magazine interview, where Watterson states that he appreciates the work of Chuck Jones and Tex Avery, and mentions the potential of animation, as there are some things he can do with it that can't be done with comics, though he also mentioned that the two mediums hardly overlaps, and it would feel strange for him to work with a full animation department. Still, that isn't to say that maybe some of the publishers took this as a sign of support for creating this kind of show, which seemed like a no-brainer at this point considering the comic's popularity, and it may have been created in secret as a result of this, probably through some loophole in his contract or something. Of course, after a while it would eventually become known to Watterson anyway, and it's likely that if this show ever was made, then he probably would have applied the brakes on the project, given his personal philosophy. But if this were the case, then it would have to have been at least a little bit of progress made on his hypothetical cartoon. And who knows, maybe we might eventually find some evidence for it somewhere. The Russian cult that worships Gadget Hackwrench is the one true religion. There are some very strange and unique fan bases out there. You've got furries, bronies, those Minecraft YouTuber people. Each of them have their own unique quirks and talents, but how many of those boast their own cults? Well, not a lot. Some, but not a lot. One outlier in this case would be the so-called Rangerphiles, those that have taken a strong liking to the classic Disney show Chip and Dale the Rescue Rangers, with particular focus on the character Gadget Hackwrench. These guys really like that mouse, probably on a level one man has for his waifu. But would you extend that devotion to the level of worshipping your waifu as a goddess? These guys in Russia certainly would. From what I've read of them, they don't exactly believe that Gadget is a literal goddess who created the universe or anything. Rather, they suggest that the reason for their worship is so that, through enough dedication and devotion to the character, they can effectively will her into existence. Most waifus, as they often call themselves, would simply take solace in the idea that their waifu is out there in another universe, and others would choose to realise them in the form of a tulpa. But these guys take it a step further beyond, by attempting to bridge the gap between worlds, thereby welcoming the real Gadget Hat Crunch into our reality with open arms, kind of like a certain other visionary we've touched on earlier. So if you already accepted the ideas posed by Christian, then accepting this cult as the one true religion wouldn't exactly be that difficult to do. Most would probably dismiss these beliefs as dumb fantasy, but I suppose it really depends on who's willing to believe what. I want to believe. Do you? Drawings have agency. This idea can function as an alternative to the concept of the dimensional merge, when suggesting how fictional characters can be real. This theory, as the name implies, suggests that physical drawings have some degree of sentience and the ability to act independently. You never really see this be the case, perhaps because these carbon or ink-based beings live on a different plane beyond our own perceptions, or maybe it's like Toy Story rules, where they don't really seem to be doing anything when we're looking at them. This may also tie into the concepts mentioned in the previous theory, as well as in the book The Secret, in which if we believe hard enough for something to be real, then we can will it into existence. Like say for example, if you constantly believe that you'll get $1 million, then you'll eventually get $1 million. In this case, when we draw something, and build a meaning or backstory behind that drawing, then in a way we can give the figures, or the world of said drawing, an environment in which they can be visualised, and therefore become real. Spiritual shit basically. Hazbin Hotel takes place in heaven. In the Twilight Zone episode A Nice Place to Visit, a thief gets shot by the police and wakes up in a world he assumes is heaven. Whilst there, he revels in fortune, wealth and popularity, so much so that he grows bored and frustrated after a month of living there, and demands for his guardian angel of sorts to take him to the other place, because he doesn't deserve to be there. The figure then replies by saying that he was actually in the other place, or hell, this whole time. Spoilers for that episode, by the way. So then, what exactly does this have to do with Hazbin Hotel? Well, not much really, but it shows us that our old ideas of what heaven and hell are may not exactly be completely accurate. Perhaps a world of eternal bliss or eternal suffering may not exactly be what we think it is visually. Perhaps we could suffer eternally for a boringly perfect world, or achieve bliss in a world that allows for complete independence in being able to act out all the vices we desired on Earth. This could possibly explain why, despite the appearance of suffering and bloodshed in the series, none of it is permanent, as they can easily come back by the time of the next cleanse, and go back to doing all the crazy shit they've done before. This isn't like Dante's Inferno where everyone's trapped and stuck in an eternal state of torture. No, they're out and about doing their own thing, surrounded in all the shit they're supposedly being punished for being involved in. I mean, you can literally get hard drugs from vending machines, and when you fuck up, you'll be back on your feet coming the next cleanse. So, if that were the case, then why exactly are all these apparently evil people here? Like, how can Jeffrey Dahmer be in heaven? I don't know, maybe God's just really nice. Perhaps that's the reason why Charlie, the daughter of Lucifer, is doing all this stuff. Heaven's too overcrowded and hell's too empty, so it's possible that maybe the purpose of this Hazbin Hotel is to tempt these wayward beings into going where they belong, promising a false paradise that in reality involves suffering for experiencing such grueling perfection. Suppose there's probably much more we need to learn about what's going down in the Hazbin Hotel. Anime means cartoon in Japanese. Basically, yeah. The word anime is, by most accounts, a shortened version of the English word animation, which was changed slightly to reflect Japanese pronunciations, like how waifu is simply the Japanese pronunciation of wife. Whilst it doesn't completely apply to political cartoons and newspaper comics, you can still very easily say that anime is basically just a Japanese word for cartoon. Guess the two mediums aren't so different after all. Hypercrisis. Hypercrisis is a phrase that can refer to many different things, but it primarily derives from a concept allegedly orchestrated by writer Grant Morrison, in which all plot lines in all DC-related fiction are connected, which may seem obvious since we got the DC multiverse, but stick with me on this. So this all originates from discussions on Co regarding the Blackest Night plotline, and how there seems to be some level of hidden collaboration between Morrison, as well as Jeff Jones and Greg Rucka, to link the work with Final Crisis, so as to create a build-up of sorts to a new Hypercrisis plotline. In addition, the theory suggests that Morrison writes his works, both in and outside DC, in a way that makes them feel all connected, with similar themes and whatnot. However, as these processes went further along, it started to appear that these connections were more than just the results of a pact between a small cabal of writers, instead suggesting that it extended to other writers without any prior intentions for this extension to take place. This continues further and further out, as the concept of the Hypercrisis grows its own legs, causing it to not only expand across the DC multiverse, but also to every other fictional universe beyond its reach. There have even been suggestions that this concept is no longer bound by fiction, and has now influenced reality itself, syncing up all fictional worlds with our own. So, when some weeb looks at something and asks if it's a motherfucking JoJo reference, then there's at least a slight possibility that it actually is. This is why the word Hypercrisis is shown on the chart this way, because it knows no boundaries, whether that be thick purple lines on some picture of an iceberg, or the seemingly impenetrable borders between fiction and reality. Cartoons are real. I don't need to explain this final point. All these theories point directly to it. They're out there, not too far beyond our own reality, poking through into our world bit by bit. The previously mentioned Bugs and Constantine connection, the practices of the Gadget cult to bridge the gap, and the hyper-crisis, already deep within the fabric of our world and influencing it from the inside. The last piece of the puzzle to truly confirm this is coming is through the final phase of Chris Chan's dimensional merge. Like I said before, the only thing that's needed is for our world to take the final leap and complete this long sought after goal. I hope you're ready. We'll be waiting. Alright then, finally done with all this. Well, only really the audio part, I've still got to like edit all this shit. God help me. Anyway, I guess it's been a long while since I last uploaded basically anything to this channel. Back then I just sort of used it for like shit posts and that sort of thing. But I've always kind of wanted to go back here and do like other stuff since then. There wasn't really much in the way of like complex editing or anything going on here. But I still hope it was like decent enough for anyone stopping by, something for people to check out if they had the same interests that I personally did, like how I did with this particular iceberg. I'm probably not going to be like posting that often here. I've still got like university and a bunch of other projects and just crippling procrastination issues to deal with right now. But that isn't to say that I don't have anything on my mind personally. Like for example, one thing I'd like to announce basically surrounds this documentary series that I've been planning to get out soon, involving the history of the video game industry, which I hope to release in time for the 50th anniversary of Pong in November. I'm kind of aiming for like a weekly thing, but it could just turn into like a Gino Samuel Chris Chan thing where I'm just sort of like releasing videos when they're done. Like the videos are done when they're done and they'll be released when they're done, as a certain visionary would say. But regardless, I've definitely got to like place a lot of effort and a lot of focus into that sort of thing to get it out in time for November. So I'm probably going to be spending a lot of my extra time doing that. So I would like to take some time out to work on other projects, other like ideas that I've had on my mind for my other accounts in different parts of the internet. I'd also like to try a couple other iceberg charts once I get that documentary series out of the way. Hopefully the concept isn't like dead and buried in the vast depths of the ocean. I don't fucking know. But anyway, yeah, that's all I'd like to say about everything. I hope you guys stick around for all the content that's coming out eventually. Probably not in a while, but eventually, you know. And until then, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a nice day.